I'm going to give a presentation that I think will help connect a lot of dots. And we're going to start with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. People say, what's that? Well, it's all of North Africa, which used to be Christian, and then all of Egypt, which used to be Christian. Egypt was evangelized by Mark, who wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He controlled all of the Holy Land, all of Persia, all of what is today Turkey. Turkey used to be the Byzantine Christian Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Turks. All the letters in the New Testament, Ephesus and Colossae and Galatia and Philippi and Corinth, all those cities were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. And then they invaded into Eastern Europe. And so this is called the Ottoman Empire. And it goes from around 1071 AD up until World War I. And so all empires go through 3 stages, right? Expanding, maintaining, contracting. So the expanding stage of the Ottoman Empire was around 1299 to 1683 until they lose the Battle of Vienna. So this was the fullest extent there. They get up to around Vienna. And then it goes through a maintaining stage. They figure, well, we're not going to expand anymore, but let's sort of consolidate. And the non-Muslim populations, like Christians, had to learn how to live as second-class citizens. Very similar to how the Democrats in the Deep South passed Jim Crow laws after the Civil War. And the blacks had to learn to live as second-class citizens, right? Republican, Lincoln freed the slaves. Republicans pushed through the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, and Democrats passed the Jim Crow laws and black codes and wanted to. And it went all the way up through George Wallace in the 1960s, and Senator Byrd and Hugo Black on the Supreme Court was a KKK member, all Democrats. And so the maintaining stage, and the Christian populations had to learn as second-class citizens, live. And so then there's the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and it's the collapsing stage. And so all empires go through these 3 stages, very much like a plant. It goes through this brand new, youthful plant, it's growing, then it goes through this period of bearing fruit, and then it goes through this period of rotting and dying. And so the Roman Empire, as long as it was expanding, it was living off the wealth of the people it conquered. And then there's Hadrian's Wall, and they said this far, no further, and they maintained. And then the Roman Empire got in debt, and it was being invaded by illegal immigrants, right? The Ostrogoths and Visigoths and Anglos and Saxons, a lot of our ancestors. And then they went through this collapsing stage. The Spanish Empire went through this. As long as the Spanish Empire was expanding, it was living off the Incans in Peru and everything, and then it goes through this maintaining, and then they get in debt, and they end up collapsing. And the same thing with the Soviet Union, right? It's expanding and living off the people, then it's maintaining, and then this arms race, they can't keep up, they get in debt. Debt is always a precursor to an empire falling. It's sort of like, I tell people, debt is fat to the body politic. What's fat? You splurge and eat stuff you shouldn't, and then you got to carry it around, and it takes energy, and it wears down on your body, and it's not brain tissue or muscle tissue, but it's, so what's debt? You splurge and spend money you shouldn't, and then you got to pay interest on this thing, and pass it from generation. So the Soviet Union got in debt and collapsed. Sort of ironic that we've been doing to ourselves is voluntarily getting ourselves in debt, which is how we collapsed the Soviet Union. Well, the Ottoman Empire was in debt. It was in debt to millions and millions of dollars to Europeans, and it couldn't pay back. So it goes through this collapsing stage. And during the collapsing stage, the Ottoman Empire begins to not able to defend its territory, and France begins to exert influence in sort of part of it. Italy, Britain, and then Russia. And so the Middle East, right before World War I, you have the British-controlled area, you have the Russian zone, you have the British, and so forth. And so the Ottoman Empire is called the sick man of Europe. And it had a sultan named Abdul Hamid II, and he had his 13 wives and 3 concubines, and lived in the big palace there in Istanbul, Turkey. And what happened was, in this collapsing stage, parts of the Ottoman Empire were breaking away. So Greece breaks away, and Bulgaria breaks away, and Romania, and Hungary, and parts of Austria, and Poland. They're all breaking away from their influence and control of the Turks. And a little country named Armenia wanted to break away too, and Sultan Abdul Hamid II said, no, we're not going to let you break away, and he kills 100,000 Armenians in 1896. Grover Cleveland is our president. He's condemning this killing, and so finally, Abdul Hamid is chased out to France, and then they have sort of a revolution, and they wanted to set up a republic, and I'll get into that, but here's a quote from John Quincy Adams' essay on the Turks. In Islam, treachery and violence are taught as principles of religion. Here's Winston Churchill fought in the Nile River War in Egypt in 1898, and he says, Islam is a system of ethics which regards treachery and violence as virtues rather than vices. And so the Ottoman Empire's headed toward collapse, so these other European powers are wanting to take away, parts of Bosnia and Bulgaria and so forth. And now, we're going to go on a quick rabbit trail. Oil. Where did oil come from in the early 1800s? Whales, right? And so whaling ships out of Connecticut, Massachusetts, were sailing around the world. Remember Moby Dick? And they take the blubber from the whale and they would turn it into oil. And then the whales were being chased to extinction. And the whales were saved by oil being discovered in the ground in Pennsylvania in 1859. And then it's discovered in Oklahoma. And then it's discovered in Baghdad. So, by 1882, John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil Company, had a monopoly on the oil industry. He was the richest man in the world. But John D. Rockefeller, there's lots of different oil companies, and so he had a sort of creative idea. He would go to the railroads and talk them into shipping his oil cheaper than his competitors. And then he would sell the oil cheaper and undercut his competitors. And then when all the competitors were out of business, he would have a monopoly, he'd raise the price through the roof, and then he would give a kickback to the railroads. He did this over and over again until he became the richest man in the world. Anyway, so Standard Oil Company was using its money to control all these different industries in America and buying influence, but in 1908, oil is discovered in the Middle East. And so the first oil wells are in Baghdad and then in Kirkuk, and so the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company is formed, and it changes its name to British Petroleum, or BP. And anyway, they have offices in Pakistan and Islamabad and 8,400 employees, 84,000. So here's the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They're taking the sign down, they're putting up the British Petroleum Company, but it's the same thing. And now Winston Churchill talks the British Navy into transitioning from coal to oil. They used to use coal to heat the boilers on these big things, and now they're using oil. So now, this is 1908, early times, so the British want oil, and Germany is beginning to get industrialized. Kaiser Wilhelm is wanting to get aggressive and expansionist, and so Kaiser Wilhelm wants oil, and oil is discovered in Baghdad, so he builds a railroad from Berlin, across Eastern Europe, across Turkey, to Gaziantep, to Mosul, Iraq, which is the old Nineveh, down to Baghdad. And then World War I starts. Half of World War I took place in the Middle East. We think of World War I with the trench warfare in France and Belgium. Half of it took place in Iraq. So here's this railroad that goes all the way down there, the Baghdad Railroad, and so the Kaiser Wilhelm makes a treaty with Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Remember him with all the bloody stuff? And there was a movie just a couple of years ago called The Promise, and Christian Bale is the actor who played Batman. Remember him? So he stars in this movie, and it's set in the time period of the Ottoman Empire, and then these Germans show up, and Christian Bale is an American reporter, And the Germans get the Ottomans to get back into their jihad mode, and pulls them into World War I, but then they decide they want to get rid of the Armenian Christian population. And so they kill 1.5 million Armenian Christians between 1915 and 1922. And Christian Bale, the actor, is playing a real American correspondent. He's reported back on the butchery of these entire Christian populations, very similar to what's been happening in the last 8 years or so forth under the previous president, of the Christian populations being wiped out in Syria, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. And even John Kerry called it a genocide. So you know it had to be really bad for somebody in the administration to call what was happening during that administration a genocide. And we've all, I don't know what we were doing these last 10 years, but it's been a wiping out of Christians in the Middle East. Anyway, so here's the Kaiser Wilhelm and Sultan Abdul Hamid. They make a treaty, they build a monument to their treaty. So this is Christian Bale in the Promise movie. I encourage you to see it, it's really well documented. So oil, discovered in the Middle East, pulls the Middle East into World War I. And you know how they use poison gas? You know, mustard gas in World War I, the trench warfare in Europe, they use poison gas over there. Remember, we still hear stories about gassing people over there? Well, it took place during World War I. And here's some book, First World War in the Middle East, Eden to Armageddon, World War I in the Middle East. And so Woodrow Wilson, during World War I, and during that Promise, when the movie where they're wiping out the Christians, World War I, Woodrow Wilson tries to come to the rescue of the Armenians. And here he is, here's Armenia, and Russia was going to come to their help, but then they have the Bolshevik Revolution, and then they don't. And so he says, we need to recognize Armenia as part of, take it away from Turkey. And we say no, because we're isolationists, you know, during and after, we're after World War I, we become really isolationist. So what happens is, between 19 and 1522, after Abdul Hamid is out, they have the Young Turks, and they say that they want to make Turkey a democratic republic. And there's this brief euphoria, very similar to after Saddam Hussein was out, and in Iraq, they said, we're going to be a republic. And we go over there and help write a constitution. Remember, they voted and they stuck their little thumbs in the ink to show they voted. And it was all this brief euphoria. And then what happened? ISIS took over. It's like, what happened? We did the same thing in Egypt. Right? They get rid of their leader, and then they're like, oh, the Muslim Arab Spring, it's going to be wonderful. And then, you know, the fundamentalists take over. And so what happened in Turkey is they say, oh, we get rid of Abdul Hamid. We're going to get rid of the Sultan. Now we're going to be a constitutional republic. So we're like Europe. There's this brief euphoria until the three pashas, these three guys, take over. And they were very plotting about it. So in other words, the first thing they did was pretend like they were going to westernize, and they get all the Armenian young men to join the military. Once they're all in the military, they say, you know what? We're going to make the Armenian young men non-combatant soldiers, which means you're still a soldier, you still hold your rank, but you're going to do more logistic stuff, and you're going to be like carrying like pack animals. You're going to be hauling stuff around, you're going to be making roads, you're going to be doing all this stuff, but you're not going to carry a gun. So once all the young Armenian men were in the military, then they were made into non-combatant soldiers, then they would send them on assignments where they would march through 4 feet of snow, and they would be freezing, and they wouldn't feed them for weeks. Then they would tell some, you know, Muslim town nearby that there's all these emaciated infidels over the hill. The whole town would empty out. Even the housewives would take their butcher knives. They would go over there and they'd kill them all. And one story was they wanted to move the Armenians from this one safe area to another place. And these Armenian soldiers said, no, as soon as we leave here, they're going to kill us. And they go to the archbishop, the Armenian, you know, bishop, and they promise him, no, seriously, we're just going to move from here to there. The bishop goes to the men and says, look, they promised me they're just going to take from here to there. And the guys say, okay. They go, no sooner are they out of the town, they surround with machine guns and kill them all. And so once all the Armenian young men are dead, there's no one to protect the Armenian cities. And so they kill 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1922. March them off the cliffs, cut open the bellies of the pregnant women, stories of starving them, and then they hold some food out. When they stick their hands out for the food, they chop their arms off. I've talked to families personally. I was speaking in Texas, and the guy said, yeah, my grandmother is from Armenia. And my grandfather wanted to smuggle her out of the country and put her in an empty pickle barrel, rolled her down to the dock, and bribed the boatmen to put it on the boat without asking questions. So she got out of Armenia by being in a pickle barrel, and she said, yeah, she was pregnant with my mother when she was put there. And so in the movie, The Promise, they have some of these tragic stories. Another one, a lady named Cynthia Davis, but her maiden name is Cynthia Gashgorian, which is Armenian, and she tells the story. Really an amazing woman. She and her husband have a Christian bookstore. She ran for state rep in Missouri. And the area that she had was, to be a state rep over, included part of the Missouri River bottom, and there was a nature preserve that was owned by the Bush family. You know, the Bush beer. And so she has a fundraiser, the Keogh decision where there were cities are taking away land because they want to develop it for tax purposes, so they're taking it away from private. And so the Bush family didn't want their land taken away from this, Great Rivers Wildlife Preserve and developed by the growing city. So they supported her. And so twice they had fundraisers at their big Bush mansion in Missouri. And I was the speaker. So it's this grand staircase that goes down. There's buffalo heads, and there's pictures of Ulysses S. Grant. Because this is the big Anheuser-Busch family mansion. And then one of the Bush family members was there. So I got a chance to visit. It was one of those cool events. But anyway, Cynthia Davis got elected, and but her maiden name is Gashgorian. And so I'm visiting with her and her family, and she's saying how she had an aunt that was pregnant during this time of the Armenian massacre. And so they're rounding up all the Armenians and they're marching them into the desert. She gives birth on the march. They make her put the baby in the ditch and just walk away and let it die. And she said she was so traumatized that she never married, never had kids after that. And then the grandfather was an Armenian minister, priest, I'm not quite sure what they call him, but he was a preacher, a bishop, and he runs home because he went to the church to get the baptism records, and comes home and tells them all to flee, and he's all shot up, and he dies, and they bust into the house. So the one, her grandfather fled. He was just a boy, and he's going from town, he's hiding under piles of Armenian bodies. And so the Muslims would go by thinking he's dead, and then he went all the way to Syria, and a Muslim family gave him a meal, and he goes to sleep. When he wakes up, there's a rope tied around his foot, and they said, "You're now our slave." And he said they got sold 6 different times. He's finally in Tunisia, in North Africa, and he's putting grain on a boat, and he doesn't know where the boat's going, but he wants to. So he hides. Nobody's trying to hide behind the bags of grain. He pulls a bag on top of him, so he's sort of hiding there. And then the boat takes off, and it goes to France, and they're unloading it, and he's peeking out, and they're unloading it. So when they're not there, he puts the bag over his shoulder and walks down the plank, and then he's off, right? And then after a while, he flees from France to America, and finally makes his way to St. Louis, and then he gets elected to the city council, and everything. And so this is the daughter. So this is Cynthia Davis. But I can tell you dozens of stories of firsthand. I don't know if any of you remember back an organization called the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship. It was headed up by Hudimas Shakarian, who was an Armenian who fled the massacre and came to California. So I could tell you these stories, but we had a movement in America to come to the rescue of the Armenians. And, but we didn't. We were too busy after World War I that we didn't want to get involved. And so, this tragedy took place. Teddy Roosevelt's giving speeches around the country, and he said, we need to do more than giving speeches. We need to get involved in helping them, and we don't. And so, Europe, before World War I, it had a map, And then after Germany lost, that map was redrawn. And there were new countries that were made up, right? So the Czech Republic and all these different, Yugoslavia was a made up country. And so the same thing happened in the Middle East. So as World War I was ending, the powers of Europe took the Ottoman Empire, which had been in league with Kaiser Wilhelm, they took the map of it and they began to divide it up. And so this was going to be the Sykes-Picot Treaty. This is what all the European powers agreed upon. Italy was going to get a certain area, Britain was going to get an area, France was going to get an area, and Russia was going to get an area, and so forth. Everything's going along pretty good until this guy comes along. Lawrence of Arabia. T.E. Lawrence. Who was he? He was a lieutenant in the British Army. And he was sent on an assignment to see if the Arab Muslims could be organized to help the British fight the Turkish Muslims. So now I got two different kinds of Muslims, right? The Turkish Muslim Ottoman Empire had existed from 1071 up until World War I, and it was the big enemy because it was in league with Kaiser Wilhelm. The Arabs were just tribes, and they were unorganized, and the thought was, can we get them to help the British? And so T.E. Lawrence does more than just check on them. He takes it upon himself to recruit them and promises them that if they will help the British, they will get all the land in the Middle East. And so, he even writes later in his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, 1922, he said, I risked the fraud on my conviction that Arab help was necessary to our cheap and speedy victory in the East, and that better we win and break our word than lose. So he knew he was lying to these Arabs, saying, yeah, you'll get all that land, just help us to defeat the Turks. Why is that important? Because that is the basis for the Palestinians claiming that they should get the land in the Middle East. Sir Lawrence of Arabia's unauthorized promise that they'll get the land. So the Palestinians said, we should be getting this land. Well, what happened was the Europeans had it, and Britain had all that land of Palestine, and that's how Britain gave it to the Jews. And so now we have an unauthorized claim and an authorized claim. So the same former Ottoman land was promised to two different groups. And so here's Lawrence of Arabia. Here's one of the guys he recruited to help. And this is an Arab. His name is Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi. So he does help the British. And the British want to accommodate him. So, by the way, there's a movie, Lawrence of Arabia. Peter O'Toole plays him. One of the scenes in there hints, because in his autobiography he talks about being captured, because he first went over as an archaeologist, and he was captured by one of the Turkish leaders and sodomized. And lo and behold, there's the whole concept of the sodomy of the Turks, where they would do this behavior. And so in Islam, the homosexual is the man on the receiving end. The guy doing it doesn't think of himself as a homosexual, he thinks of himself as super macho. Right? He can have 4 wives and so forth. And so it's a sign of aggression, very similar to prison systems in America. Right? Some guy gets in prison and they do that act. And so in Pakistan, for example, the story is that most young boys' first experience with sex is being beat up and raped by a bully. And anyway, so that's in the movie, it's hinted on it, but you know, so it even gets more interesting. Do I have your attention? I mean, is this interesting? So during World War I, Britain is running short on explosives. Right? You're fighting a war, you sort of need explosives, and so one of the chemicals needed to make explosives is acetone. And there is a Russian Jew that immigrates to Britain. His name is Chaim Weizmann. C-H-A-I-M, it's pronounced Chaim, it's got that little throat sound. Anyway, he makes a breakthrough in synthesizing the needed solvent acetone by a bacterial fermentation process. So now they have more than enough acetone, they got more than enough explosives, and it really helps the British in their war effort. And afterwards, they're so grateful that they offer to make Chaim Weizmann a sir or a knight or give him a big estate. And he said, no, I was really looking forward to having a homeland for the Jewish people. And the British say, well, how about Uganda? We control Uganda, we'll give Uganda to the Jews. And he's like, no, I was really thinking of the traditional area. You know? And so, Lord Balfour was the Britain's foreign secretary. He issues the Balfour Declaration in 1917, establishing a Jewish homeland in the former Turkish land under British control. So this is the first time since the diaspora in 70 AD that the Jews have their homeland back. So it's a big deal. And here is Lord Balfour, and here is his letter. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and sympathy for the Jewish Zionist aspirations, establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people. And then the next year, Lord Balfour says, my personal hope is that the Jews will make good in Palestine and eventually found a Jewish state. It is up to them now. We have given them their great opportunity. So this was the land that the British gave the Jews. It's called the British Mandate of Palestine. It went from the Mediterranean Sea to Iraq and Syria down to Egypt and Arabia. And it's really large. Well, there is this leader of the Arabs in Egypt and Arabia. His name is Al-Husseini. He's the Sharif of Mecca. So that's sort of like Mecca is the big city in Islam where you take your Hajj to, your pilgrimage once in your life. You know, they teach that in our public school system now. Wealthy Muslims have bought the textbook companies. And so they teach Islam to the students. I don't know if you knew that. I was in Orlando, Florida, and a father told me about his son getting a text on his iPhone. And the text said, you did not turn in your prayer rug assignment. And the dad says to the son, what's the prayer rug assignment? He goes, oh, we have to make the Muslim prayer rug and practice saying the Muslim conversion prayer, the Shahada, where you say in Arabic, but there's one God, Muhammad's the prophet. You say it 3 times in Arabic. And he said, and the dad's like, well, aren't you going to do a Christian study too? And they said, no, you know, separation of churches. And he goes down to the school, says, what's this Muslim prayer rug stuff? And they have to learn the Muslim convert. Can't they learn like John 3:16? Oh no, separation of church and state. And so the son has the notes, and he says, you weren't supposed to bring the notes home, but he brought the notes home. And it has religions, and it has a paragraph or 2 on Jews, and maybe a couple paragraphs on Christianity. And it ends by saying Jesus was considered a troublemaker by the leaders of his day and executed, period. And then it has 5 pages on Islam. And you know, it's going, oh, it's wonderful, and all these great things came from Islam. And he goes, this is the indoctrination. So these kids are being, so I talked to a pastor speaking in Orlando, or in the area around there. He said, yeah, the public school is having sort of an interfaith thing, but it was invited an imam to speak. And so he's speaking, he says, well, Allah sent the Jews, but they failed, and then Allah sent Jesus, but the Christians failed. So finally Allah sent Islam, and it's the final revelation. And so this pastor says, you know, raises his hand and says, well, I have a question. You know, and he begins to question it. And a kid turns and says, Christianity's had its time, old man. And then all the other kids say, yeah, and they shot the guy down. And then the principal sends out a letter and says, I heard that there was an old man trying to interrupt our assembly. I'm so proud of our students for not allowing him to do it. So this is happening in the public school systems. And just a few more years later, there'll be a whole generation of them out. And it's not just not teaching Christianity, it's teaching that Christianity is the problem with the world. And the Christians told, they were the slave traders, and they were the Indian Removal Act, and they were all those Christians are terrible. Not mentioning how most hospitals were started by Christians, most universities were started by Christians. You know, the whole university system was started by Catholics, you know, in Europe. Orphanages and medical clinics and missionary movements around the world to help the poor in the villages and digging the wells. They don't talk about that. get a little preachy, so I apologize. So here's al-Husseini, and so he has two sons. The British like al-Husseini because he did help them defeat the Turks. And so they take one of his sons, named Fazl, and they make him the king of Syria and Iraq. So the son of the Sharif of Mecca in Arabia is now the king of Syria and Iraq, named Fazl. And in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, Peter O'Toole plays Lawrence of Arabia, and who plays Fazl, the king of Syria and Iraq? Alec Guinness. Now you know Alec Guinness, he was the star of, in another movie, Star Wars, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi. This is Alec Guinness. Anyway, that's just a little actor trivia. So here's King Fazl, the real guy, king of Syria and Iraq, and he goes to the Paris Peace Conference after World War I, and he welcomes the Jews back to the Holy Land. He had just gotten control of all of it, and he is thankful to the British for installing him, and the British want to give part of it to the Jews, and he's like, well, you know, I'm a brand new king on area that was won and given to me from the Ottoman Turks to me, and so he's generous and wants to go ahead and let the Jews have a part of it. And so he writes this: we feel that the Arabs and Jews are cousins, and having suffered similar oppressions at the hands of power stronger than themselves, we look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. Wow, that's a little different than today. But so here you have the Arab king of Syria and Iraq welcoming the Jews back. And so here is Fazl. He still looks like Alex Guinness, but that's King Fazl. This is Chaim Weizmann, the Jewish chemist that developed the acetone process, and now he's the first, ends up becoming the first president of Israel, but this is before then. This is back in the 1919. And so this is the huge area that, here's Syria, here's Iraq, and this is the area that the Jews were going to get. It's part of the British mandate. Now, France was given the protectorate, sort of like America had Puerto Rico as a protectorate, and for a while we had the Philippines as a protectorate. And so after World War I, the European powers would take these different areas as protectorates. And so France has a protectorate in Syria, but then they begin to get a little more aggressive and begin to take over stuff, and it's about to break out into a war in Syria. And the king of Syria and Iraq is Fazl, and he ends up losing control of Syria completely to France. And he's a little bit upset. It's about to break out into a war. And so, to avert the war, Britain agrees to give up half of its mandate of Palestine, to take it away from the Jews, and to create a new country called Transjordan on the other side of the Jordan River. And they put Fazl's brother in charge, Abdullah, as king. So they take the area that was going to all be Jews, and they created a Palestinian state. Now they didn't call it a Palestinian state because the word Palestine was always the homeland of the Jews. The word Palestine comes from Philistine, and it goes back to the Romans. So when the Jews, 70 AD, the Romans finally destroyed it. They killed 1 million Jews in the conquest of Jerusalem. And then they took another 1 million Jews and killed them in their celebrations, right? Their Colosseums, you know, how they would say, give the Christians to the lions, well, they killed the Jews. And so Jews were forbidden to go within sight of Jerusalem. And then once the Roman Empire became Christian, after Constantine converted around 313 AD, the Christians allowed the Jews to come back to Jerusalem once a year to pray at the Wailing Wall. And but nevertheless, the Jews were scattered around the world, and so the Romans got a Jewish guy named Josephus to write a history of this now exterminated people group called the Jews. And so Josephus writes this sort of obituary, and he gives the whole Jewish history, and that's the history of Josephus. And so the Romans renamed Jerusalem Capitolina Jupiter, right? They stick a statue of Jupiter where the temple used to be, and they want to secularize it. And this is before Constantine. This is 70 AD. So Constantine was 313 AD. So this is 70 AD. So their Jews are scattered away, and they forbid Jews from coming within sight of Jerusalem on pain of death. So that's the way it was in 70 AD. Once it became Christian, the Jews would come back once a year to pray at the Wailing Wall. And so the Romans renamed Jerusalem Capitolina Jupiter, and they renamed the land Palestine. Now that word Palestine comes from Philistine. But there were really no Philistines there, because the Jews had now controlled this whole area from the time of David on. But they came back and they just sort of took this name and reapplied it to that area because they wanted to wipe out the memory of the Jews from the land. So it's called Palestine, and so when France begins to take over Syria, the King Faisal of Syria and Iraq is upset, and so to sort of appease him, the British cut this in half, and they make a brand new country called Transjordan, and this is given to the brother of King Faisal, Abdullah. And so the Jewish land, they only get it for just a couple of years, and it's already cut in half, and now they create a Palestinian state. I'm just using that word because they want one today. Well, they already have the land of Transjordan. The name was eventually just shortened to Jordan. And so Faisal is the king of Syria and Iraq, but no longer Syria, but just Iraq. And there's his dad, al-Husseini, and this is Abdullah. And Abdullah is now the king of Jordan. And do I still have your attention? Okay. Now, here is Abdullah, and here's Winston Churchill. So he likes Winston Churchill. Why? Because he's British, and the British gave him the kingdom. It used to be part of the Ottoman Empire that the British helped defeat. And so Winston Churchill, there he is, and there's Faisal, and there's the British, and so they're basically putting him in as a, I don't want to use the word puppet dictator, but this was this big Western power that is installing a leader who's friends with them, because the Britain helped defeat the Ottoman Empire. Now, here is Turkey. And this was the area that they used to control. Greece breaks away and takes a huge chunk of it. And Greece also wants this chunk, because it all used to be ancient Greece. And the Turks rally. And so the Armenians wanted their ancient land from Turkey. So just like Israel wanted its ancient land back, the Armenians wanted their ancient lands back, and the Greeks wanted their ancient lands back. And so the UK, France, Greece, and Italy all are attempting to rule Turkey. But the Turks get a leader named Attaturk. And he rallies the Turkish people to maintain control over their land, what we call today Turkey. And so Greece and Italy and those others, they don't get their land back. So this is now an independent Republic of Turkey run by Attaturk. The French now control this area. There's Lebanon, which is independent, but it's underneath of the French mandate. And then there's the British mandate that used to be all this, and now it's cut in half with Palestine going to Abdullah. And then this is Iraq under Faisal. Is this making sense? It's important to lay the groundwork so you understand what's happening today. And now Attaturk, the name Atta means father, and then Turk, so it means father of modern day Turkey. And here he is, the military leader. But it turns out he is a really good leader, and he wants to secularize the Turkish government. And he said, look, we've had a bad experience with sultans getting violent, wiping out people, getting into jihad. And so here he is meeting with King Faisal of Syria and Iraq. And the idea was that the great Ottoman Empire that had been from 1071 was gone, and it was a blow to the gut of fundamental Islam, very similar to Japan after the atomic bomb was dropped. They felt like their emperor let them down, their Shinto religion let them down, everything that they had trusted let them down, and so they were open to Western ideas. And so so Japan became more Westernized. This is the same thing that happened in the former Ottoman Empire. So Attaturk wanted to have a secular Turkey, and he moves the weekend from Friday, which is the Muslim holy day, to Saturday and Sunday. He outlaws the fezzes, the hats, he outlaws the burqas, he outlaws the Muslim beards. He is the first one to educate women in Turkey. And he gets women involved in educating. He dresses in Western business suits. Right? He's all shaved. He looks like a 1930s Hollywood actor. And so here is Attaturk of Turkey, and here's King Faisal of Syria and Iraq. See how they're wanting to dress in Western clothes, send their kids to Western schools, teach English and French in their countries, Westernize it. And so here's Attaturk. And Mustafa, Kemal, Attaturk, he led Turkey 1923, 1938. And he, again, wanted to separate from that fundamentalism that the sultans had that were killing all these Armenians. So Attaturk says he is a weak ruler who needs religion to uphold his government. And then he said, even before accepting the religion of the Arabs, the Turks were a great nation. We don't need the religion of the Arabs to be a great nation. We're Turkey. So he says Mohammedanism was based on Arab nationalism above all nationalities. And then he says the purpose of the religion founded by Muhammad over all nations was to drag them into including Arab national politics. It might have suited tribes in the desert. It is no good for a modern progressive state. So Attaturk wants to separate Turkey from all that fundamentalism. Now let's look at Iran. It had a leader that our CIA went over there and unseated. The CIA would come into a country and organize riots and then overthrow a leader, and then we would put in somebody that's our friend. Just like the British put in their friend Faisal in charge of Iraq, and they put in Abdullah over Jordan, and so America helped to send the CIA in and unseat, and then we put in the Shah. And sort of interesting, it's been coming out more and more how our CIA would do this, and so in the last 8 years, we've been experiencing this deep state organizing of riots in America to change the leadership. We've been experiencing on our home soil what we've been doing over on other countries' soils. We're getting a little bit of our own medicine now. Anyway, so here is the Shah of Iran. And he's been helped to be installed by America, and so he likes America. Here he is meeting with Eisenhower. And here he is meeting with Truman. And here he is meeting with John F. Kennedy. And there is the Shah and Kennedy and his Jacqueline and his wife. During this period, Iran is so pro-America, it's actually more pro-America than Israel. That's how pro-America Iran was. I met the Shah's son, right? He lives in Maryland, and so it's all moving in a westerly direction. You got Attaturk in Turkey, now you got the Shah who's friends with America, there's the Shah and his wife. This is the 1970s in Iran. It's a disco, right? I mean, look at the girls, they dress like Americans, And this is, again, Iran in the 1970s. It looks like Southern California, right? Hippie movement or whatever. And again, this is Iran, 1970s. This is Kabul, Afghanistan. I mean, here's girls dressing in regular Western clothes, going to school, right? They're being educated, they have freedom, and so forth. Here is Syria in the 1960s, a beauty pageant, right? This is westernizing, and matter of fact, Lebanon was called the Paris of the Middle East. And it was this jewel city and freedom, and it was like westernized. And then there's Egypt. Now Egypt had a king named Fuad. Now he does change the name of king from sultan to king. So at least he westernized the name. But King Fuad was sort of a lush, and he had an enormous pornography collection, and he would go over to Italy and just eat lots of food. His favorite was oysters, and he would eat hundreds of oysters at a time, and finally he actually ate too many and he gagged to death and he died eating oysters. And so this is King Fuad of Egypt, and there he was meeting with Herbert Hoover. And so when Fuad's out, we have a new leader in Egypt called Kemal Nasser. And he wants to westernize Egypt. Here he is with his family all dressed in Western clothes. I mean, he looks like, you know, a Hollywood actor, you know? And this is Egypt in the 1960s. Again, it looks like California with the Beach Boys. You know, I mean, here's girls in their swimming suits. This is Cairo, Egypt? And just in the 1960s and 70s. And so here's Nasser in Egypt on the cover of Time magazine. Here's these girls dressed in the most modern, you know, clothes. You would have thought that was a street in America. And 1958, Nasser is speaking at a political convention. He says, I met with the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he sat with me and made his requests. What did he request? To make wearing the hijab mandatory in Egypt, and demand that every woman walking the streets wear a tarha scarf. Audience laughter. I told him, my opinion is that every person in his own house decides for himself the rules. He replied, no, as the leader you are responsible. I told him, sir, you have a daughter in the School of Medicine and she is not wearing a tarha. If you are unable to make one girl who is your daughter wear a tarha, you want me to put a tarha on 10 million women myself? Sustained laughter. What happened? How did we go from the 1970s with secular leaders in the Middle East wanting to be friends with the West to what we have today? How did it happen? Well, two things. Remember al-Husseini in Egypt, in Arabia, and his two sons, Fazl, king of Syria and Iraq, but then no longer Syria, but he's still king of Iraq, and then another son, Abdullah, who's the king of Transjordan, which is just Jordan. He begins to balk on a treaty that the British want him to do. The British are flexing their muscles, and they're like, okay, we're going to decide what's going to happen in the Middle East. And he is like, no, I don't want to go along with this extra treaty that the British want. And the British are like, look, we put your sons in power, you know, you need to sort of do what we want. And he sort of balks, he sort of resists. Well, at the time, Arabia is just a pile of sand, and it's really not of any strategic purpose. And so the British start to stand back. And while they're standing back, the Saud family teams up with the Wahhabis, and they begin to conquer Arabia. And they at first say, we'll work with you, British. So the British are like, well, maybe we'll switch allegiances to the Saud family. And so the Sauds team up with the Wahhabis. Who are the Wahhabis? They're a violent group all the way back to the 1700s, and they are into cutting off arms and legs and having harems and all kinds of that very, very strict Islamic practices. Even Lawrence of Arabia, in his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, 1922, says the Wahhabis, followers of a fanatical Muslim heresy, had imposed their strict rules. Everything was forcibly pious or forcibly puritanical. So he's even calling it a Muslim heresy, right? Because the Muslim world at the time was wanting to be friends with the West, and here's this, they're just into the chopping off of the heads and so forth. And so here's William McCantis, Brookings Institute scholar. Saudis promote a very toxic form of Islam that draws sharp lines between a small number of true believers and everyone else, Muslim and non-Muslim. Saudis, both the arsonists and the firefighters, they provide ideological fodder for violent jihadists, that's the Wahhabi teaching, yet at the same time there are partners in counterterrorism. So it's a little bit of a contradiction there. So, as the Saud family teams up with the violent Wahhabis, they conquer a little outlying village, little tent group of wandering, Arabs, and finally they conquer Mecca in 1924. Why is that significant? Mecca is where the Hajj is. 5 pillars of Islam. Once in your life, you're supposed to go to Mecca. And on this pilgrimage, you get to change your name after you went there. And now that the Wahhabis control Mecca, people from around the world are coming and getting infected with the fundamental Wahhabism. And they're going back to their corners of the world spreading it. Right? We hear the stories of these contagious diseases, and maybe it's in an airport, and then it gets spread really fast all around. So prior to 1924, the Sharif of Mecca was Al-Husseini, who teamed up with the British to get rid of the Turks, and whose 2 sons are the British put in king of Syria and Iraq and king of Jordan. And so even though Al-Husseini balked on the treaty, he still was more pro-West. Well, after 1924, he no longer controls Mecca. The Wahhabis control Mecca, and now the people on their Hajj are getting infected with the violent Wahhabism. 2, the big change was oil was discovered in 1938 by Standard Oil Company in Arabia. So just like oil was discovered in Baghdad, and that drew the Middle East, the sick man of Europe, the falling apart Ottoman Empire, drew it into World War I. Now, 1938, Standard Oil Company discovers oil in Saudi Arabia. And in one generation, Saudi Arabia goes from the poorest Muslim country to the richest Muslim country. Now, Standard Oil is a globalist company. And it has a son, John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller's son is David Rockefeller. And they had to break up with the antitrust stuff, so they turned into Exxon, Mobil, Chevron. They started this globalist Rockefeller Foundation. They controlled J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, and David Rockefeller founded this globalist Council on Foreign Relations, and David Rockefeller founded the Trilateral Commission, another globalist group, and the Rockefellers give the land for the UN building. So the UN building is built on Rockefeller land. So the Rockefellers are more or less globalists. They have a global financial empire, and so they're more or less globalists. And so with their help, Saudi Arabia goes from the poorest Muslim country to the richest Muslim country. Now, Saudi Arabia begins to become a magnet for fundamentalism. So the rest of the Muslim world, after World War I, said, hey, you have to be like the West. That's the future. They got the technology. They got airplanes. They got televisions. They're developing all this stuff. And we got mountains of useless sand. And so let's move like the West. But once oil is discovered, Saudi Arabia goes from the poorest Muslim country to the richest Muslim country. The rest of the Muslim world says, well, gee, maybe we should be more fundamentalist to be blessed, rather than more secular to be blessed. So us buying oil from Standard Oil Company and buying oil from Saudi Arabia, making them rich so fast, and that becomes a magnet for these other, so we've actually created this situation. Us buying oil made Saudi Arabia so rich so fast, it becomes this magnet for fundamentalism. And I was talking, anyway, so what do they do with their newfound money? They buy politicians. Right? Politicians need money to get elected, and so they will give money to every different party in every different country. And there's even a line attributed to Muhammad, and it was, don't forget to bribe the Byzantine ambassadors. So the Muslims during Muhammad's time wanted to get the Christian Byzantine Empire, and if you bribe the ambassadors, they're not going to warn their country because they're personally profiting off of it. And so this is the idea where you begin to see a financial interest in the West, betraying the West to Islam because the people doing it are getting paid for it. But then the Saudis fund groups that push Wahhabism. And so here they are with their pipelines across Arabia. This Wahhabism is the father group of all these other fundamentalist groups. So ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, the Salafi, the Taliban, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Hezbollah, Al-Shabaab, Muslim Brotherhood. These are all groups that are spawned off of Wahhabism. And so their goal is to have a USSR of Islam. They want all the Muslim countries, they want to pull the rug out from all these kings, and they want to have a one country, they want to basically rebuild the Ottoman Empire. And then from there they want to control the world. And their ultimate goal is to have the whole world under one Muslim leader called a caliph. That's the leader, that's the successor to Muhammad, right? The caliph. So the area he controls is the caliphate. And so the Muslim Brotherhood started in Egypt in 1928, and it says Allah is our objective, the Quran is our constitution, the Prophet is our leader, jihad is our way, death for the sake of Allah is the highest of our aspirations. So now the Muslim Brotherhood is doing what? It's targeting the secular leaders in the Middle East. You're being friends with the infidel West. And so these secular leaders that are friends with the West, they want to be more westernized, they're having these fundamentalist, WAHABI type people stirring up unrest in their own backyard. And so the West, predominantly America, would prop them up to help them to crack down on these fundamentalists. But then you have leaders saying, oh, well, these dictators are not being democratic. It's like there never was a democracy in Muslim countries. Right? There's no concept of equality amongst the fundamentalists. When Napoleon in 1798 went into Egypt, conquers it in 2 weeks, and then he's going to bring the French concept of democracy and liberty and so forth, and equality. There were no Arabic words for equality or democracy or liberty. They were always ruled from the top down. And so there never was democratic governments in the Middle East. You give them a democratic vote, the fundamentalist ones intimidate everybody else, and they vote in Sharia law. So we were propping up these leaders who were friends with the West. But now they're having these fundamentalists trying to bring insurrections underneath. So what verses in the Quran do the Muslim Brotherhood look to? Surah 47:4, when you meet the infidel on the battlefield, strike off their heads. Another verse, Prophet, make war on the infidels. Another verse, 191, kill the disbeliever wherever we find them. And so the Muslim Brotherhood began to infiltrate all these countries in the Middle East and threaten them that if they become too much friends with the West, they're going to get targeted with terrorist attacks at home. And their plan of the Muslim Brotherhood is twofold, based on the two cities Muhammad lived in, and maybe I'll get to that by our time. In Mecca, Muhammad was a religious leader. And then he gets confrontational, they chase him out of town for disturbing the peace. He has nowhere to go, he goes to Medina. It was a Jewish city, and they were tolerant, and they let Muhammad in as a Muslim refugee. Muhammad goes into the minority neighborhoods, and he finds people who have grievances against the Jewish government, and he organizes them. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community. And when the following gets big enough, he begins to get involved in politics, and he begins to demand political accommodation for him and his new followers. And the Jews naively make a treaty with him. Now Muhammad's a political leader. And then when Muhammad's followers get chased out of Mecca, he allows them to rob the caravans headed back to Mecca. So it's different than Jesus, who said, love your enemies, turn the other cheek. If they take your coat, give them your shirt, you know. And Muhammad's attitude was, if they chase you out of town and take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. So Muhammad gets a whole chapter of the Quran on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. It's Surah 8, chapter 8. The title of the chapter is Spoils of War. And there's verses like 33:50 that says, Allah has given you the slave girls as your booty. And so the Muslim warriors of Muhammad would rob the caravans, and anyway, then he ended up conquering the Jews in Medina, chasing them out of town. So within 5 years of Muhammad coming as an immigrant to the Jewish town of Medina, there's not a Jew left in town. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. So we see that the phase is you first come, this is Muslim Brotherhood, the first is you act like Muhammad when he first came to Mecca as a religious refugee. And then once you get in enough numbers, you demand political involvement and accommodation, and then you eventually become violent and drive out the previous inhabitants. Very, in a sense, parasitic. So a parasite will come in, live off the host victim, and sort of be unnoticed for a while, but then it grows and it eventually threatens the life of the host victim. And so this pattern is twofold. So there's the Meccan phase of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Medina phase. The Meccan phase is you come in and you're a nice, friendly immigrant, and the Medina phase is when you begin to flex your muscles politically and then break out in military violence. And so this is what they did in all these countries. So at first they would infiltrate these secular Muslim countries, and they'd get into positions of power, and then once the switch was thrown, they would become violent and they would overthrow the leadership. So Egypt, it had a leader named Sadat. So after Nasser, right, you got a leader named Sadat, and he does the unthinkable. He makes a treaty with the Jews. And so the Muslim Brotherhood had infiltrated the Egyptian military. And so they're having a parade. And Sadat is in the bandstands with his vice president Mubarak. And the soldiers are coming by, and it's just a really nice parade. And then a group of the soldiers stop, turn, point their weapons, and they spray the bandstand with machine gun bullets, and they kill Sadat. And Mubarak is wounded, he falls off, but he takes him to the hospital, he survives. And America helps prop up Mubarak to crack down on his Muslim Brotherhood. And that's the way it was until President Obama got elected. He goes over to Cairo, and he disinvites our ally Mubarak, and then fills all the front rows with Muslim Brotherhood people. And then he sends over all those community organizers, and they organize to overthrow Mubarak, and then he actually gets on the phone and calls Mubarak and says, time to step aside. And Morsi takes over Egypt for a year or so, and he begins to push this fundamentalism. And they're like, you know, driving tanks and mowing down Christians in front of their churches and all this stuff. And so it was a miracle that 26 million Egyptian people gathered in the square, and they shove out Morsi. And then they set up a new leader there. And, you know, so miracles do happen, you know? And so these were the Egyptian people saying, look, we're Muslim, but we're not fundamentalist ones. We like the old-fashioned kind where we like some of the freedoms and equalities that you know, the women can have and so forth. But in some of these other countries, they were having trouble. And so, for example, in Libya, President Obama decides that he can't get rid of Gaddafi. He sends in our military, and we wipe him and his family out. And so now the Muslim Brotherhood is able to take over Libya. And then he's moving the guns from Libya over to Syria to unseat another Muslim leader named Assad. And they're moving the guns through Benghazi, right? And it was a gun running operation.
Right.
And anyway, I'll tell a little bit more about that later. But so the middle ground Muslims are like being friends with the West, but now they're being pressured by the fundamentalist ones. And in Islam, they have a concept: when your enemy is strong, retreat; when your enemy is weak, attack. It's the law of nature. And so when the secular and non-Muslim world is strong, the fundamentalist ones retreat. They sort of go into remission. But when they do a little poke, and the middle Muslims and the secular world just sort of collapses, they're falling over. They think that's Allah's indicator that they're supposed to get aggressive and attack. So, anyway. So here we have, did you know Hitler was going to send all the Jews to Palestine to get them out of Europe? I mean, here's the homeland for the Jews after World War I, and he's like, shove them out of Germany and just send them over there. But then the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Muslim leader, who Yasser Arafat claims to have been related to, the Mufti of Jerusalem says, we don't want the Jews, kill them. And so Hitler meets with the Mufti of Jerusalem, and the Mufti actually raises an entire Bosnian Muslim Panzer division to fight alongside of Hitler. And he raises the Arab Legion. So these are Muslim fighters in the Nazi army. And so when they finally stormed into Berlin and Hitler's in his bunker, the Allies find there's 100 Muslim Arab Legion soldiers protecting Hitler. And anyway, so there's Hitler and the Mufti. So again, Hitler was just going to send the Jews to Palestine to get rid of them, and the Mufti says, we don't want them. And so that's when Hitler sent the Jews from Hungary and the Czech Republic and so forth to the gas chambers. Now, FDR, he was really naive. After the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, he's over there meeting with Stalin, meeting with Churchill, having the map of Europe and doing the dividing thing again. And his method of politics was everybody get some drinks and buddy up, and you're like, oh, you know, let's just do this. Stalin was like stone cold, you know, with steel, and he's like, get him as many drinks as possible. I mean, this is just 2 months before FDR dies. I mean, he's sick, and so Stalin pressures him to cut half of Europe and condemn it to 70 years of communism. So FDR should not have been negotiating that. Anyway, on his way back, he stops off in the Suez Canal on the USS Quincy, and he meets with the king of Saudi Arabia, supposedly under the pretense of seeing if they could help the Jews to resettle in Palestine after Hitler tried to kill them all. And so this king of Arabia blindsides FDR. He says, oh, the Jews are terrible, the Jews are horrible, you don't want the Jews, this and that. And FDR, like, I mean, the king actually has a goat slaughtered on deck to barbecue for their lunch. I mean, just kills it right there and cooks it, you know. And anyway, so FDR goes back to Washington, D.C., and he writes a letter to the king of Arabia and says, thank you for educating me on the history of the Middle East. I didn't know all of that, and you can be assured, as long as I'm president, that the United States will never recognize Israel as a nation. That was April 7, 1945. Within a week, FDR finally dies. Truman takes over, and the first thing Truman does is to recognize Israel as a nation, right? And as the UN. So, this oil in Saudi Arabia is causing it to be so wealthy. I was talking with Rick Perry. He's the head of the Department of Energy, and he was the former governor of Texas. So we were speaking at pastors' conferences all around the country, and he was at one of the conferences. He says that he was in the Air Force in the 1970s, stationed in Arabia. And he says these Arabs were just learning how to drive cars, and they didn't know traffic rules. They're just sort of wandering everywhere. And they go in one generation from, again, the poorest Muslim country to the richest. They go from camels to gold Cadillacs. And Saudi Arabia becomes this enormous amount of wealth. Billions and billions of dollars. And so Riyadh, Saudi Arabia is this unbelievably wealthy city, and yet Arabia is the most fundamentally violent city. So they still have Dira Square in Riyadh, it's called Chop Chop Square, and every week they chop off arms and legs and heads. I talked to soldiers that have been there, and they said if an American is in the crowd, they push him in the front. And the soldier said, yeah, I witnessed a woman being, stoned to death for rape. So if a woman goes outside of her house and she is not covered, she's accused of rape, and she's whipped 100 times and killed. Because if a woman is not covered, she's allowing herself to be used as a tool of Satan to tempt man. And so if she's raped, it's her fault for tempting the man. And anyway, so they still do this today in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So here they are, the wealthiest Muslim country, and they're the most fundamentalist Muslim country. Now there's a new king of Arabia, and he is beginning to show changes. And I'm not sure all that's happening, but I think the threat of Iran, which is Shia, is greater than the Sunnis, which is all the rest of the Muslim world. And so the king may be thinking, I would like to side with Israel and America because we need their help against the Shiites, which Obama gave billions of dollars to Iran. Yeah. So, real quick, Sunni Shia, so you know the difference. So Muhammad never had a son, he had a daughter named Fatima. And she's married to Ali. And so Ali is Muhammad's son-in-law, and the followers of Ali are called Shi'ali or Shiite. And there's 10% of Muslims who are Shiite, and they trace themselves to the marriage between Ali and Fatima, and they have a son named Hussein, and then they end up having grandsons until there's Sharifs, meant a blood descendant of Muhammad, and so the last one was shoved in a well, and they think he's going to come back. He's the hidden imam, and so when they think that he'll come back, he'll usher in the return of Christ. But when their Christ comes back, he's going to kill all the Christians and kill all the Jews and kill all the apes and kill all the pigs. So their definition of Christ is the Christian definition of the Antichrist. So that's who the Shiites are looking forward to. That's the Ayatollah. And so the Shiites are a very hierarchical, top-down form of government, very similar to the Catholic system with a pope. Right? So it's more of authoritative. 90% of Muslims are Sunni, and there's all kinds of different variations and flavors depending on the local imam. And that's, if you were to compare, that would be more of the Protestant model, because you got lots of different denominations, and they're all depends on the different ones. So 10% of Muslims are Shiites, mostly in Iran. 90% of Muslims are Sunni, and they're scattered all around the world. And Fatima and Ali have a son named Hussein. So this would be the Shiite side. He's murdered by the Sunnis. And so there's this hatred between the two of them. The Shiites want to keep alive the hate. So every year they have a festival called Ashura. And so they'll get together and they'll hit themselves on the back, they'll take knives and hit themselves on the head, have their little boys, they'll hit their little head up, and the blood comes down, and they get together and they would rock back and forth, and they would groan, and they would feel sorry for the murder of Hussein, until they whip themselves up into this emotional frenzy. Hussein was murdered! And so then they keep the hate going against the Sunnis. And so that's how they've been able to maintain the hate between the Shiites and the Sunnis for all these years. And anyway, is this interesting? Yes. So Muhammad dies, and the first leader after him is Caliph Abu Bakr. He has a daughter. Muhammad had a dream 2 nights in a row of him marrying the 6-year-old daughter of Abu Bakr, one of his generals. And Abu Bakr says, well, I'm your general, but you're the prophet. Here she is. And so Aisha is her name, and she says how when she was 9 years old, she was playing in the backyard on the swing, and she comes in, and her mother takes a rag and dips it in water and washes her face, and then the Muslim women say, Allah's blessings and good luck. And she said, the prophet visited me that afternoon. I was 9 years old. And so she ended up becoming one of Muhammad's favorite wives, and there's a whole lot of history there. She's traveling, and they're going on a caravan, and she has to relieve herself, and so she gets off the camel without telling anybody, goes over a sand dune. When she comes back, the caravan's gone. And some straggling guy sees her, puts her on her donkey, and takes her back to Muhammad. And the Muslim men said she was with a man, and the man wasn't her husband, so he must have raped her, and so she needs to die. And Muhammad said, okay, you need 2 or more witnesses to have seen the rape, otherwise it didn't happen. So that became law in Islam. So if a woman is raped, she's not raped unless there are 2 or more witnesses to the rape. And then you add to that in Islam it says that a woman's testimony is half of a man's testimony. So you would need 4 women to say that they witnessed the rape, otherwise the rape never happened. And you add to that a non-Muslim cannot testify against a Muslim. So if it was a non-Muslim that was raped, and there's a whole bunch of non-Muslims witnessing, it never happened. And then even if you can prove the woman was raped, she's the one that gets whipped 100 times. And so it's a whole different legal system than what we're used to. This is called Sharia law, and this is what they practice in their communities whenever they come in and take over. Why do I get into all that? So this is what is taking place, Sharia, with the WAHABIs. And the WAHABIs are being funded by all the oil we buy. But since I'm on the subject, so we got Muhammad, he dies. Abu Bakr is the first caliph. He's murdered. The next caliph is Caliph Uthman, and he's the one who compiles the Quran. I'm sorry, Umar. He conquers a whole bunch. Then he's killed. Then there's Caliph Uthman. He compiles the Quran because Muhammad and his original followers were illiterate, and the word Quran means recitation because it's an oral thing. Anyway, so Uthman's murdered, and then you have Ali. And so now you have the Shiite who is the Caliph. And so Ali, for this brief time, is the uniter of the Sunnis and the Shiites. So finally you got one. But Ali didn't go after and kill the murderers of Uthman. So Uthman's family has to retain their honor. They have to wage war because you have, in order to keep your honor, you gotta fight. So they wage war on Ali, and the battle is that the warriors are fighting Ali with spears, and they put Quran verses on the end of their spear. And Ali's men don't want to hit the Quran verse, and so they surrender. And so then they eventually capture Ali, and then he's murdered. And then you're back to some more of the interesting story. But they're all son-in-laws or father-in-laws of Muhammad. The whole first generation after Muhammad. It's all a family. We're familiar with the Sopranos, or the family. This was all this powerful family, and it was all Muhammad, his son-in-laws and father-in-laws that controlled this growing empire. But Arabia, you have them with the fundamental Wahhabis and all their wealth. And now Iran, remember the Shah, we helped put him in power, and he's friends with America. And then Russia begins to try to make a play for Iran. But the fundamentalist Ayatollah wants to get involved in Iran. And so rather than support the Shah, like we were supporting Mubarak and we were supporting all these other leaders, Saddam Hussein was supported by Bush. So we were supporting these different ones. Jimmy Carter abandons the Shah. Jimmy Carter had a national security advisor named Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose daughter is an MSNBC, Mika, whatever. And so Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said, let's let Iran fall to the Ayatollah, and it'll be a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union and help bring the Cold War to an end, because it'll be such a expensive problem for the Soviet Union. And so Jimmy Carter abandons the Shah and lets the Ayatollah take over, and thank you, Jimmy Carter. And so, in the 1970s, the fundamentalist Muslims murdered 2.4 million Hindus. And Nixon and Kissinger are too busy with the Vietnam War. And so we do nothing. And so again, that concept, when your enemy is strong, retreat. When your enemy is weak, attack. So we're beginning to appear weak. Here we are abandoning our ally, the Shah. We're not responding when all these Hindus are being killed. And Reagan, I loved him, but when 241 U.S. Marines were killed, when they blew up a Marine barracks in Lebanon, his response was to tuck tail and run. Just pull all of America's presence out. It's like, oh, great. And so the Muslims are like, man, the United States is a paper dragon. Yeah, they look really tough, but you just blow up one bomb and they'll all leave. So again, when your enemy is weak, attack. And so we're thinking we're being nice, but we're actually fueling the aggression. And so in 1955, Constantinople, right, it changed its name to Istanbul, which means the city. And so Attaturk was a really good guy from 1923 to 1938. Well, they get another leader in there, and he wants to go back to the Sultan style and become fundamentalist. And so in 1955, they block off the Greek neighborhoods, and they kill, rape, and pillage all the different Greek Christian stores and businesses, and drive about 80,000 Greeks out, and destroy, dozens of ancient churches and graves, and drag the Greek Orthodox priests from their bed, rip out their beards, and circumcise them in the street, and all kinds of stuff. And but it was just whipped into this jihad frenzy. Those of you that are into how wars and these type of things get started, they wanted to have an event. So the idea is you need an event that can spur a response. And so the event was that they were going to attempt to blow up Attaturk's home, which is in Greece. And they were going to blame it on these Greek Christians. Well, the bomb never went off, but the newspapers ran with it anyway, and they stirred the people up, and they blocked, the government, had trucks that just happened to park at the end of the streets in the Greek neighborhoods with all these shovels and picks and everything, and people pick them all up, and they just smash all the Greek stores and so forth, and all the rest of the Greeks flee. Now there's only a little fraction left, and so this happened in the 1950s. Somebody that was there at the time was Ian Fleming, was a reporter for the London Sunday Times, and he said hatred flowed in the streets like lava. And you know Ian Fleming because he wrote a series of detective novels called James Bond. Right, so the author of James Bond was a reporter, and he witnessed the Istanbul pogrom. Now, some of the leaders after that tried to say, no, let's get back to more secular, and then some of the leaders want to make more fundamental. And the new guy in there pretended like he was going to continue the secular mode, and then once he gets in, he says, forget this, I want to be the next caliph, the next sultan, and I want to rule over the whole united Muslim empire, and his name is Erdogan. And he is causing Turkey to slide into a Muslim dictatorship. This is one of his quotes in The Economist. Democracy is like a train, said Mr. Erdogan, once you get off, once you've reached your destination. So you use the democratic process to get in office, and then you destroy democracy and you stay in office as a dictator. And so the people of Egypt, when they met in their Tahrir Square and they got rid of all the fundamentalists, they said, we don't like Obama, we don't like Erdogan, we don't like terrorism. And a message from the people of Egypt. So again, you have all these Egyptians, they're Muslims, but they're of the after World War I type. They sort of want to enjoy the freedoms. Now, another thing that is important to understand is the price of oil has been going down. So Saudi Arabia has been struggling financially, and because basically every Saudi citizen is on welfare. It's like they all get free money for life. And so they're running short, and so they need to have a new source of a market to sell their oil. And so there's this plan to have a pipeline from Qatar, across Arabia, across Syria, across Turkey, into Europe. This way the Saudis can supply oil and gas to Europe. The problem is Russia's #1 export is oil and gas to Europe. So Russia does not want to have the pipeline go through them. The king of Syria is friends with Russia, and so he's saying, no, you're not going to run this pipeline across my land. And so John Kerry says, well, we want just a little more, just because we want to knock off the Assad and put in another leader that is favorable to our, globalist plans. And Russia said, no. And so I've talked to security people that said a number of times in the past that Saudi Arabia would provide an incident that would allow America to get into a war to help unseat Assad. And sort of like the chemical warfare incident that allowed us to get involved and unseat Saddam, they needed an incident, and so there's evidence that the gassings were not done by Assad, of those people, that they were done by terrorist groups that got it from a long way around from the Saudis. But they needed an incident that would allow America to get involved in it. I know it's really complicated, but Syria, there's two problems. One, Syria, Assad is an Alawite, which is a minority Muslim sect that is so secular that when the France controlled Syria, they did not even consider Alawites Muslims. And so Assad went to school in America, and he allowed every group to have their own province. So it was sort of like a balancing act in Syria. There's some Kurds over here, there's some Christians over here, there's some, Muslims. Everybody has your own little province, and he would do this balancing act. But he would give millions of dollars to the little Christian groups, like a town called Mulala, and they still spoke Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke. And it was up in the mountains, a little community, they still taught it, they still spoke it, until ISIS came in there and wipes them all out. And so it makes no sense that he would want to destroy people that he had given millions of dollars to help. But the same way that the CIA would go into these countries and stir up and unsettle them so that they could displace the leader, it looked like there was this plan under the previous president of the United States to go in there and stir it up. And so, anyway, here is Asian Times. It says, writing in Armed Forces Journal, Major Rob Taylor joined numerous other pundits in observing that the Syrian civil war is actually a pipeline war over control of energy supply, with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey needing to remove Assad so they can control Syria and run their own pipeline through Turkey. Here's another article. It's the gas stupid. Harvard professor Mitchell Ornstein, George Romer, wrote, Foreign Affairs, Russia currently supplies Europe with a quarter of the gas it uses. In fact, 90% of the gas that Russia's state-controlled company Gazprom produces is sold to Europe. Russia, which uses its power over gas as a political leverage, and has a history of cutting off supplies of gas to Europe in conflict and so forth. So Russia not only supplies it, but they would use it to turn it on and off, so they're not wanting to give up this leverage. So, the 2 points I'm wanting to make is after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was now is gone, and the Muslim world wanted to become more secular, and the Wahhabism, which spawned off all these fundamentalist groups, they came along, but then the big change was Saudi oil was discovered in 1938 by Standard Oil Company, and this was the fuel. This was like throwing gas on a spark, and this spreads this Wahhabism around the world. And so there's 3 springs in the 1400-year history of Islam. These are political military expansions. The first is an Arab-Persian spring from 622 to 1071. Second is a Turkish spring from 1071 to 1923. And the third Arab spring started in 1928. So again, this one went on until they were stopped by the Byzantine Empire. This one went on until the end of World War I, and this one is going on today. So, how do moderate religious Muslims who believe the world will submit to Allah in the future, how do they turn into political militant Muslims who believe the world's going to submit now? So, after World War I, the non-Muslim world showed itself strong. The fundamentalist Muslims went into remission. And a large amount of Muslims in the middle, they're like happy to enjoy the new freedoms and liberties of the West. But how does it change? How do they switch from being the moderate to the militant? Well, President Bush was the first president to speak in a mosque. He's the first president to celebrate Ramadan in the White House and put a Quran in the presidential library. And Laura Bush was the first American woman leader to put on a Muslim veil. And Nancy Pelosi put on the Muslim veil. And Hillary Clinton put on the Muslim veil. Why is this important? Remember those women in beauty pageants? And those women wearing Western clothes and going to Afghanistan wearing their Western clothes? They're all wanting to be like the West, right? That's their dream. And when the top leader women in the West come to their countries and submit to the fundamentalist Muslim world, it lets all the air out of the women's movement in the Muslim world. They think, oh, we're being really respectful to the Muslims. They don't realize they are popping the balloon. They are undermining all the effort of these women in these Muslim countries that wanted to become more westernized, wanted to have the freedom to dress the way they want. And anyway, so we have Western leaders putting on the Muslim veil, right? And whatever. And then we have 3,000 Muslims praying on our U.S. Capitol lawn. Why is that significant? Number one, every place they pray, they claim as belonging to Allah. And but what would we think if Billy Graham had a crusade in downtown Mecca with 3,000 people show up? Or maybe with Pope John Paul having a rosary and 3,000 people show up. And so this is very encouraging to them. It's the symbol that the West is showing itself weak. And then we have the Democrat Party and lots of Muslim candidates, running for office there. And here is a public high school in Colorado. where the students are saying the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under Allah. The entire student body of Rocky Mountain High School, Fort Collins, Colorado, one nation under Allah. And this is a public high school. American public schools is forcing Christian students to learn a Muslim prayer. And it's their conversion prayer, their shahada. And practice putting on little scarves and practice taking Muslim names. And this is a Tennessee public school, middle school, forcing non-Muslim students to praise Islam and say that Allah is the only God. And see the teachers, isn't this cute? They're all learning how to pray to Allah. And another school, this is happening in our public schools right now. And because the Muslims have bought the textbook company and they bribe politicians, say, you want to get elected, here's a lot of money. And here's Chicago, they have youth and the Muslim groups. And I took this picture with my phone, this is in Virginia, Imam and so forth. And the West issues Muslim postage stamps. What would we think if Pakistan issued a stamp of marrying baby Jesus for Christmas? Yeah. We would think, oh, they're more open to us, to our ideas. This is encouraging to them. Here's another article. It says, Muslim warns anti-terror laws could prevent teaching from the Quran. So, and then I threw this picture in there. You have to look at it for a second. Smile. So here's a Muslim man taking pictures of all his wives. And then we have a Muslim swearing into Congress, Keith Ellison, on a Quran. Now, why is that significant? The Quran says that its laws come directly from Allah, and they are superior to man-made laws like constitutions. So how can you swear to uphold the Constitution on a book that says it's superior to the Constitution, and the Quran says it's okay to lie to make it superior? It's called taqiyya, sacred lying. And so then Obama tells the head of NASA, perhaps foremost, Obama wanted me to find a way to reach out to the Muslim world and engage much more dominantly Muslim nations that don't feel good. This was in Al Jazeera. NASA Administrator Charles Bolton. I talked to a guy that worked for the Goddard Space Center. He's like, when they heard that, they couldn't believe it. He goes, the NASA is supposed to reach out to the Muslim world? It's like, I thought we were supposed to do space stuff. And then Obama had all these imams that had come to the White House so often, they didn't even get carded. And then a wealthy Muslim Saudi prince, Ali bin Talal, over the years, he gave money to suicide bombers. He gave money to CARE, the Center for American Islamic Relations, which has terrorist ties. He has money to do lawfare, where they do jihad through lawsuits. He donates money to Harvard, Georgetown for Islamic Studies, and he bought an interest in News Corp and Fox, Wall Street Journal, AOL, Disney, Twitter, and so forth. His idea was you spread Sharia law through buying companies. And in the West, people sort of want to please their company owner. And if the company owner is a visible Muslim, you voluntarily change your behavior and your dress and your actions so as not to offend them, because you don't want to lose your job. And now it is interesting, and I haven't totally all figured out, but the new king of Saudi Arabia put him under house arrest for a long time, right, in a super fancy hotel, but he was under house arrest and basically, made him give up some of his money. And so there's dynamics there that I still haven't totally analyzed, but the world is changing. This is the former king of Saudi Arabia, and this is President Obama, and he's, bowing to him. Very similar to Kissing the Ring and The Godfather. Why do I say that? Saudi Arabia is the most fundamental Muslim country. Even the CIA.gov website lists countries and all statistics about their religions, and Japan and percent Buddhist, and India percent, Hindu. Well, it has Saudi Arabia 100% Muslim. Why? Because it's the death penalty to be anything but. And so the two holiest cities in Islam is Mecca and Medina. They're in Arabia. And so bowing to him sends a signal to the Muslim world. And here he is visiting a mosque, taking off his shoes and showing respect. And so you have to understand, Islam is a religion of honor or pride. And when you show respect and deference to them, it expands. And when they're embarrassed or ashamed, they contract. And so whenever they've lost major battles and they feel ashamed, they contract and they go through a generation of being more moderate. And whenever they're honored and respected, they expand. And then he gives a speech. Whatever we once were, we're no longer a Christian nation. When I talk about it in my books, I read through every state constitution. Did you know 9 of the original 13 state constitutions required all office holders to be Protestant Christians?
Yeah.
I mean, here's South Carolina. The Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed the established religion of this state, 1778. Did you know you could not hold office in North Carolina prior to 1868 unless you were a Christian? It's right there in their constitution. Right? Even up until 1968, New Hampshire had it in its constitution that laws shall be based on evangelical principles. And then they changed it in 1968 to high principles. You know, but you read, so religion was under state's jurisdiction. That's what the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments were. They were handcuffs on the federal government to keep it from becoming a big monster like King George was. I mean, all you got to do is read the preamble to the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights. To prevent an abuse of power by the federal government, certain restrictive clauses shall be placed on it. Right? So Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment. Who's limited by that? I think Congress. That's the federal body that makes laws. If they would have seen ahead that the president would make laws through executive orders, they would have said Congress and the president shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And if they would have known that the Supreme Court would make laws on the fly from the bench, they would have said Congress, the Supreme Court, and the president shall make no law respecting the establishment. It was the states putting handcuffs on the federal government. Congress shall not take away the right to possess and bear arms, or freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Wanted to make sure that the federal government would not become a big centralized monster like the King George was. And anyway, it wasn't until 1947 that religion was taken out of state's jurisdiction, put it under the federal, the Everson case. You know, Hugo Black, the KKK member that became a Democrat senator, and then FDR put him on the Supreme Court. Did you know Hugo Black was never a judge before in his life?
Yeah.
He was a Democrat senator from the South, and here he is, a Supreme Court justice who takes religion out of state's jurisdiction, put it under the federal. So it used to be some states would have blue laws where everything's closed on Sunday. And other states wouldn't have. It was up to the people. Like today, some states have marijuana and others don't. Back then, some states gave a little more religious freedom. Some states didn't. It was up to the people in the states to decide. Anyway, so Obama sort of ignores that Christian history and says, whatever we once were, we're no longer a Christian nation. And they pray 5 times a day. And they're asking Allah to lead me not in the way of those who went astray and those who have the wrath of Allah upon them. They know that these are references to Jews and Christians. And so they're basically deriding Jews and Christians in their prayers 5 times a day. And the place where they pray, they claim to be for Allah. So President Obama campaigned for Odinga. Who is he? He's a leader in Kenya who wants to bring Sharia law in there. And when Odinga lost, Obama pressured them to put him in as vice president. But when it's lost, the Muslims rioted and they killed thousands of people in Kenya. And here's Reuters newspaper. 200 displaced people sought refuge in the Assemblies of God Church. A mob set the church ablaze, and those attempting to escape were attacked with machetes. And so this, these are Muslim Brotherhood connected people that had infiltrated were in the Obama administration. And some of them are still there. They're called Obama holdovers. And it's a real threat. Obama put them into deep, I was talking with Michelle Bachman. She said Obama put them deep into employees' unions, which means they're lower level and they can't be fired. So you get a new president, he replaces the top guys, but the structure underneath is the same. And so they say, okay, I do this, and somehow or another, it just takes forever to get things done, the paperwork, the shuffling. And so Hillary, when she was Secretary of State, she was using U.S. taxpayer dollars to rebuild mosques in all these Muslim countries, right? She rebuilt mosques in 27 countries, $770 million, and it was part of a UN cultural, heritage thing. Notice she didn't rebuild any churches that were destroyed. And so she meets with the head of the OIC. These are wealthy Muslims, and they donate money to her campaign. And this is the OIC. So the UN has the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Everybody's equal, women and men, and you can join a religion, leave a religion, freedom. 57 Muslim countries joined the UN, and they formed a subgroup called the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And they don't like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, so they came up with their own Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. And they said that women are not equal to men, you can beat your wife, and you can kill anybody that leaves Islam. And so Hillary meets with them, and she promises to help them with their goals, and it's called the Istanbul Process. And so here he is, OIC, Hillary Clinton, head of the OIC, and there she is, and she's meeting with them. And so, a few years before, there was a cartoon, Danish cartoon, Muslims rioted, and the EU quickly pushed through a law that says nobody can insult Islam. And it's now law in Europe. I've been on TV programs that air over there, and I said, oh no, you can't mention Islam on this show because we air it over there, and the EU would shut us off. And so, you have to understand, you have a crisis, right, a cartoon, and then you have laws shoved through really fast to take away people's freedom of speech. So the crisis comes first. So, Hillary, as Secretary of State, refuses to let help go to our U.S. ambassador in Benghazi, and it's killed. And 6 hours into it, she's beginning to say, it's these people that insulted Islam with this video. We have to quickly shove through a law that says nobody can insult Islam. It's these Christian pastors, it's these people that are saying negative things about Islam. They're the ones that are stirring up, right? Zbigniew Brzezinski, you know, before he died, said, oh, you can't yell fire in a movie theater and say you're protected by the First Amendment. You can't say something that stirs the Muslims up to rioting and say, oh, I'm not responsible. Right? So instead of saying, no, you don't get to riot, it's limiting the freedoms of those who cause them to get upset. It's very similar to a preschool, a daycare. And the kids are all getting along. They have to learn how to tolerate each other. And maybe there's a wealthy guy, and he's got his little Johnny, and he wants to put him into the daycare. And the daycare needs money. And so the owner of the daycare walks little Johnny down the aisle or the hallway and puts him in the room and tells the teacher, we want little Johnny to have a really good experience because we need the money, right? And so the teacher says, hey everybody, say hi to Johnny. Oh, hi Johnny. And then Johnny starts punching the other kids. And the teacher says, be really careful, don't get little Johnny upset. And then little Johnny like scribbles on other kids' stuff and then rips their little coloring books up. And they're saying, you gotta be really careful, don't just, you know. And then we find out that kid comes in with a bloody nose. What happened? Little Johnny hit me. You can't get little Johnny upset. And then we find out that little Johnny is punching the other kids because he doesn't like the color yellow. He says, okay kids, take your little crayon boxes to the trash can. Everybody throw away your color yellow. You don't want to get little Johnny upset. How silly would that be? If that's exactly what we're doing with our foreign policy. Okay, everybody in the world, we all have to get along, but this one group, we gotta be really careful not to get them upset. So you have to give up your freedoms so that they don't get offended. That's our foreign policy. Anyway, so here's Hillary. She was doing gun running, taking guns from throwing over Gaddafi, moving them through Benghazi, Libya, over to Syria. And our guy, our ambassador, is being killed. Our men are being killed. They're watching it real time with satellite. They're watching it. There's the calls for help. And you know the movies and everything. These guys were like ready to help, and they get the stand-down order, right? And so they're all killed. No sooner are they killed than she says it's this video insulting Islam. We got to have everybody give up all their freedoms so that we don't insult the Muslims. And then here's an article: U.S. switched sides in the war on terror. They allow $500 million of weapons to reach Al-Qaeda jihadists. And so she was funneling these guns to them. Here's Judge Napolitano. Hillary Clinton approved arms for terrorist enemies of the U.S. Here's another Fox News. Docs show weapons going from Benghazi to Syria. And so here they were going from Libya over there. And Judge reports Clinton, ISIS funded by the same money. And, you know, so here's Hillary meeting with all these fundamentalist Muslim groups and long-term concerns that Clinton knew Saudis fund ISIL. And here's another, when Obama took over, there was peace over there. He pulls all of our people out and allows this power vacuum, and then we end up funding the wrong people. And leaked documents reveal who was behind jihadist recruitment. Obama. And Obama released Taliban leaders to go over and lead the ISIS. And declassified docs ordered CIA to train ISIS. The Judicial Watch came up with 100 pages of formally classified stuff. So Hillary aided rise of ISIS. Former Libya military stockpiles located in Benghazi, Libya were shipped from the port of Benghazi, Libya to the port of Banayas in the port of Bono in Syria. The Syrian ports were chosen due to small amount of cargo traffic transiting these two ships and so forth. Medium-sized weapons shipped from Syria during late 2012, sniper rifles, all RPGs, and all this kind of stuff. And then under Obama, we were still selling billions of dollars of weapons to states that support jihadists. And here's the Los Angeles Times. In Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon fight those armed by the CIA. It's Los Angeles Times. Our government is supplying guns to these groups over there, right, to destabilize it so that they can get rid of the leader. And I thought, thankfully for this, President Trump ends covert plan to arm Syrian rebels. Russia has pushed us to end the program. This is Time magazine. So Obama had going a covert plan where we were arming the rebels. We were arming these people, and of course the Christian minorities were being killed in the middle of it all. And so we over on this side have gone from ignoring the Christian minorities in the Middle East. I mean, we just totally didn't even know they existed, we didn't even care, we were ignoring them, to now we're supplying the guns that are killing the Christians in the Middle East. I mean, how long can a just God allow that to happen? So these are towns that we freed from Saddam Hussein, and they've been taken over by ISIS. And anyway, their goal is they want a USSR of Islam, United States of Islam, and called the Caliphate. And they want to reestablish their caliphate on a global scale. And there's Israel. Does anybody think that if we abandon Israel that they'll suddenly get peaceful again? No. If Israel ever fell, every Muslim in the world would think it's happening now rather than later. And they would all go into the aggressive mode. And then we have this merger, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood discussing mega mergers, so they're all working together. And then Muslims increasing their population in Latin and South America. So there's Trinidad and Tobago's 12% Muslim, Guyana 15%, Suriname's 25% Muslim. I was in Bogota, Colombia last November, and they said that the FARC narco-terrorists are bringing Syrian and Iranian Muslim terrorists over from Iran. They're bringing them into Venezuela, and then they're bringing them into Colombia, and then they've infiltrated the drug gangs and they're coming across our southern border. And so, anyway, so here's, you know, all these, they were meeting with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and so here are these drug gangs coming into Latin South America, coming across our border, and here's a Hezbollah chapter in Venezuela. It says GOP rep, ISIS Mexican drug cartels are talking to each other, and Homeland Security advisor, very true, ISIS may have crossed the border. ISIS running training camps on Texas border. These are the young children that Obama led into the country. Nightmare on the border, ISIS Mexican cartels teaming up, marriage made in hell, this is Alan West. And so these are the MS-13 members that are coming into all these cities in America. Talked to a guy that worked for a busing company. And he says that they did contracts for, you know, under Obama, and they were like taking the people from the border and then coming all the way up to all these different cities and dropping them off into all their Section 8 housing complexes. CIA is starting some terrorist armies pouring in, like these tennis shoes. Legals continue to walk over the border. Texas sheriff reports ISIS terror cells crossing the southern border. And this was Ferguson, Missouri. This is Jake Tapper. I was up on ISIS side. I used to live 30 miles from Ferguson. The mayor of Ferguson worked on my congressional campaign. You know, this was back in 2000. And, you know, really nice guy. And 99% of the people riding in Ferguson were not from Ferguson. They bust them all in. And they advertised in Chicago newspapers, join more Missourians organizing for reform and empowerment. And they got $33 million from George Soros. And in Missouri, they had pictures of the local TV camera crew going up to the door of these liberal churches where they're doing training, and they say, oh, sorry, you can't come in. And what are you training? Well, you can't tell. Well, what happens is they go out and they train them to stand in front of oncoming traffic, hold hands and block the traffic. And then they set all these cars on fire and everything, and they create this neighborhood crises. And then I talked to Ed Meese, former Attorney General. He says wherever they would do these crises, Obama's Department of Justice would come in and monitor the Sheriff's Department to make sure they were not doing discrimination. And they would basically take over the Sheriff's Department. So the Sheriff, instead of looking down to pleasing the people that voted him in, he's now looking up afraid that he's going to be accused of some federal crime. There's a polarity change from the bottom up form of government to a top down. And it was happening in Milwaukee, in Charlotte, in Baltimore. All these planned crises where the Department of Justice would come over and take over the local police departments. And Detroit wanted to bring in 50,000 Syrian refugees. I was in Helena, Montana. And they said, we don't want Syrian Muslim refugees. Okay, they brought in Congolese Muslim refugees. They can't even speak the language. They don't know any skill. And they just turn all these Section 8 housing complexes into little Muslim cities. And terrorist fires. And so this is California news report. They're saying, well, there was terrorists that set those fires. And this is way back in 2010, Muslim communities across the state and the country. And but you stand back, I read lots of history, so you see trends. Western civilization has gone from a Judeo-Christian Western civilization, right, Europe, with Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, Jewish neighborhoods, and then it goes into a secular Europe with the French Revolution and Robespierre, and Napoleon's bringing French secularism all around. It's anything goes, free sex, LGBT, whatever, and now it's entering an Islamic Europe, with Muhammad being the #1 name for newborns in London, Milan, Brussels, and so forth. And so, it turns out that the alternative sexual agenda is simply a creative way to cut ties with the Christian past, but it's quickly co-opted by an aggressive Islamic future. So the whole gay agenda is a transition phase from the Judeo-Christian past to the Muslim future. And Obama brought all the gays into the military, which pushes out traditional Christian values, and then into the military comes the proselytizing for Islam. So the military women, they have to wear the veils and burqas when they go into the Muslim countries, and then, you know, we got, what's wrong with the U.S. military personnel being Muslim? Well, it's a religious system, a political system, and a military system. And so bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, a political bowing, a military pledging of allegiance with another capital. And anyway, so this is happening in the military, in the prisons, and so forth. And so we see Western civilization, Judeo-Christian, secular, Islamic. And I just thought I'd come and encourage you a little bit today, you know. Anyway, quote from David Horowitz: the unholy alliance between the left and radical Islam presents the greatest threat the U.S. is facing in our lifetime. So the left and the radical Islam are working together. So there's Islam and liberalism helping Western civilization to advance. And this is a quote from a Catholic Cardinal, Robert Serra, appointed by John Paul. He said, like two apocalyptic beasts, the two major threats, the LGBT lobby and ISIS, the same demonic origin of these two. You cannot join Christ and Belial. Anyway, so there's Germany, 10 years ago, 3 mosques, today there's over 200, and they got no-go zones. France got 751 no-go zones in Paris, and Britain has all these cities where they're not practicing Sharia law: Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester. Remember the Beatles? You know, that's all Muslim now. #1 name for newborns. Belgium has a growing Muslim population. I talked to a lady from Belgium. She used to go back every year to Brussels and buy cookies and stuff. And she says last time she went over, they almost mowed her over with cars. You know, and the whole area is all just Muslim. And she says, I'll never go back. And she's married to a retired admiral out in Montana. Anyway, so Netherlands, all these no-go zones, and Sweden, all these Muslim neighborhoods. Anyway, every rape assault in the city of Oslo in the last 5 years have been committed by a person of a non-Western background, a Norwegian euphemism for Muslim. And anyway, so acid attacks. Did you know that last year there were 900 acid attacks in London? So they ride up on a motor scooter, they throw acid in your face, and you scream and fall on the ground, and they jump on your motorbike and ride off, and you're there screaming for somebody driving by to give you a bottle of water. So now they're setting up water sprinkling stations on the street corners in London so that you can go there and get your face sprayed really fast. And so
it's a strategy where you first come in as a Muslim immigrant, and then you increase numbers and get involved politically, and then you begin to have random militant outbreaks, and you drive out the former inhabitants. And so it's a three-step process. So there's a religion of Islam, which, as long as it's just a belief system, really doesn't bother anybody. I mean, whether somebody believes in reincarnation, whether somebody believes in whatever, as long as it's just their thoughts, and I still have my freedoms, that's okay. I mean, I don't agree with it, but it's not bothering me. But when they begin to in place political Islam, when they begin to want to persecute you and take away your freedoms and say you can't insult Islam and you can't, then it's beginning to change. So there's a freedom for all religions in America, but is Islam just a religion? And so the way of explaining it is the word light. What does the word light mean? Well, light in grammar, it's a source of illumination. Light is also an adjective. It's the opposite of the word heavy. And then light is like you're going to light a fire. And so light is a noun, an adjective, and a verb. All right? Did you catch that? It's a noun, like a thing. It's an adjective, descriptive, opposite, heavy. And it's a verb, like you're going to actually light something on fire. So Islam is one word with three meanings. So it's a religious system, what direction you want to pray, but it's a political system with laws dictating behavior, and it's a militant system that wants to kill non-believers in Israel and so forth. And so the one is all right, I don't agree with it, but there's a lot of things I don't agree with, but it doesn't bother me. But these wanting to change political laws to take away my freedoms and to threaten my wife and family if they walk in a no-go zone and want to, you know, Tocqueville said in 1843, there have been few religions in the world as deadly as Muhammad. Its social and political tendencies are, in my opinion, to be feared as a form of decadence. So he's saying it's political tendencies. So it's not just a religion. It wants to change the laws to take away your freedoms. Winston Churchill, individual Muslims may show splendid qualities, but the influence of the religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world. So we don't have a problem with the person, we have a problem with the teaching. It's not a hardware problem, it's a software problem. Right? It's not the laptop, it's the software that's running on the laptop. It's not the person, it's the teachings that are running in their head. Jen Cardinal, Islam assumes state-powered rules people. So again, it's not content with coexistence. Gert Wilders, Netherlands, Islam is a political ideology that wants to dictate every aspect of life. Islam means submission. If you want to compare Islam to anything, compare it to communism or national socialism. These are totalitarian ideologies. So we'll do that real quick. What are, in the last 70 years, what are the political military systems the world has had to face that have, one, the global conquest aspect, and two, non-adherence were not equal? What am I saying? Well, the last 70 years, global conquest, that would have been maybe the Nazis, right? And the Jews were not equal. So, we love the Germans, but we stand against the political ideology of Nazism. And we love the Italians, but we had to stand against Mussolini's fascism. And we love the Japanese, but we had to stand against Emperor Hirohito's imperialism. And we love the Russians, but we had to stand against Soviet communism. And we love the Chinese, but we had to stand against Mao Zedong's collectivism, right? And we love the Arab and the Turk and the Palestinian and so forth, but we stand against the political ideology of fundamental Islam. And if a politician says Sharia law is compatible with the Constitution, they're either ignorant, or they're afraid, or they're profiting and getting money donations and so forth, or it's taqiyya, they're just lying to your face. And here's a sign on a demonstrator in Detroit years ago: we will use the freedoms of the Constitution to destroy the Constitution. And this was an interesting quote from Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, Time magazine. The Bill of Rights contains no grant of privilege for a group of people to destroy the Bill of Rights. A group dedicated to the ultimate destruction of all civil liberties cannot be allowed to claim civil liberties as its privileged sanctuary for which to carry out subversion of the government. So you can't say, I want freedom of speech, but I want to set up a form of government that will not allow freedom of speech. I want freedom of religion, but I want to set up a system that does not allow freedom of religion. Right? So you only grant freedom to those who grant freedom, to have it continue. You ever see this? Yes. The idea is let's all get along. Well, it depends on what each group teaches its group to treat those that are not in the group. Right? And so Christianity says, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, right? Israel, Judaism says that every person's made in the image of the Creator, so everybody gets equal rights. And it even says, be nice to the stranger because you were once a stranger in Egypt. Buddhism has something called karma, which says what goes around comes around. So you want to be nice to people because it's going to come back around and hit you, you know. But Islam has submission. And it feels like its goal is to have the whole world submit to the will of Allah. And the best way I found to describe it, when my son was little, I got him a fish in a little goldfish bowl. Then we got him some more little goldfish. Then he saw this little feathery fish, really cute, and he wanted it, so we put it in the bowl. The next day, these other fishes had little nips taken out of their fins. Within a couple of days, all the other fishes are dead, floating on the water, and there's just one fish left in the bowl. It's a little Siamese fighter fish called a beta fish. And so why didn't they all get along? Why couldn't they coexist in the bowl? This fella had it in its DNA to be aggressive. And so you got all these different religions. Why can't they get along? Well, what's in the DNA? Jesus says, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them, resist not evil. Someone strikes your one cheek, turn the other. Well, Muhammad said, infidels are your sworn enemies. Be ruthless to the infidel. Make war on the infidel, fight those who believe not in Allah. And anyway, but I have to remind myself, the church was born into a one-world anti-Christian government, the Roman Empire, and the church eventually won. So the God of the Bible is not concerned about if it looks like it's a dangerous situation, because the church was actually born in the middle of a dangerous situation. And so Christianity is the fastest growing religion, 80,000 added every day, mostly in Africa, the Middle East, India, and Asia. And Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world, with over 500 martyred each day. So where the persecution is the greatest is where the revival is the greatest. And anyway, let's see. I wanted to cover something at the beginning of my talk. I sort of jumped into it with the Ottoman Empire. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. And this is all going into your subconscious. You're all going to have really strange dreams today. What did he talk about there? And, but I wanted to go back to some stories at the beginning just to make it all come together. And there. So we talked about the switching and then all these different things happening. I wanted to get into, we say, well, these violent acts are happening, and the ones that are doing it, they're not really representing true Islam. Have you ever heard of the news policy? Those terrorists, they don't represent true Islam. Okay, well, who can tell us what true Islam is? One person, Muhammad. So he's the best Muslim that ever lived. And his life is actually called the Sunnah, which means the way, or the example. So we ought to study his life to know what is the magnet that's pulling people in his direction. His life goes through 3 stages. He was a religious leader, a political leader, a military leader, and this is very foundational. We need to know this. This is the world 20 years before Muhammad was born, the Byzantine Christian Roman Empire. It's all Christian. Look at that, all around North Africa. It's being attacked by Persia, and so the two beat each other up. We have a power vacuum. Into that power vacuum came Islam. Muhammad's father died before he's born. Mother dies when he's 6. Grandfather and guardian dies when he's 8. He's taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, at year 12. And Muhammad goes with his uncle on camel rides. And they go to different cities, and he's exposed to different religions, and he begins to hear different things and sort of compile them. Little pagan stuff, little Zoroastrian, little Jewish, little Christian. He marries a wealthy widow, Khadijah. She's 40, he's 25, and so he doesn't have to work. And in 610, he begins his faith. He goes into a cave and prays. A spirit appears to him, squeezes him, commands him to read. He said, I cannot read. Spirit squeezes him again, said, read. He said, I cannot read. Spirit squeezes him a 3rd time, says, read. He said, I cannot read. Found the spirit, threw him down, and he began to recite. And the word Quran means recitation, because it's an oral thing. And anyway, people say, they say, how can you remember those verses? Because there's so many of them. In Arabic, they had a little rhyme to them, a little beat, very similar to rap music today. So maybe there's a student in school who can't read, but he memorizes these long rap songs. You know, it has a little beat to it. And so this was like the Quran verses. They had this little beat to it, right? And Muhammad gathered a following, and he would have them recite these verses. And I go through how he mixes different things of different religions. And even Encyclopedia Britannica stated of Muhammad, the gospel was known to him through apocryphal and heretical sources. So he thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. So he's born 570 AD. 595, he marries Khadijah. 610, he starts his faith. 619, Khadijah dies. 622, he flees from Mecca to Medina, and then he fights in all these different battles, and he dies. So This is the point I wanted to cover. He's in Mecca for 12 years, and he has this new religion, and he only makes 70 converts in 12 years. And he begins to get confrontational. And the people of Mecca decide that he's a disturber of the peace, and they chase him out of town. He tries going to a city called Al-Taif. They don't want him. They pelt him with rocks and stones. So he has nowhere to go. He is a Muslim refugee. And so he goes north 210 miles to a Jewish city called Medina. The Jews are nice and tolerant, and they let Muhammad in as a Muslim immigrant. He goes into the minority neighborhoods, and he finds people who have grievances against the Jewish government, and he organizes them into a following. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community, right? When his following gets big enough, he goes to the Jews and pressures them to accommodate him and his followers politically. And he wants to get involved in politics. And anyway, the Jews make a treaty, so he's a political leader. When his followers in Mecca get confrontational, they get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They are Muslim refugees. And there are a lot of them, and they come to Medina as Muslim immigrants. The Jews let him in, and Muhammad allows his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing him out of town. So here's the caravan route, starts in Cairo, Alexandria, comes through Medina, where Muhammad and his men rob them, and what's left comes down to Mecca. And so the people of Mecca are hurting, and they send 1,000 soldiers to escort their caravans. And Muhammad, with 300 warriors, defeats 1,000 at the Battle of Badr. And he's able to capture their caravan. This amazing victory, having been outnumbered 3-1, convinces Muhammad to be a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He even uses the catapult when he attacked the city of Al-Taif. And when they told Muhammad the catapult was hurling these rocks that were killing women and children, his response was, "They are among them." So they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers and ISIS killers say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did. And since he is the perfect Muslim, Muslims that want to be better Muslims, they want to be like him religiously, politically, and militarily. So, there's freedom for all religions in America, but Islam is not just a religion. Because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political and military leader too. And so a mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. Bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, a political bowing, and a military bowing. Pledging of allegiance to another city. And our effort to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. Who are we to split their prophet? He was all three. And anyway, so it's RPM, like in your car, revolutions per minute. So you remember that, right? And so they do something called victimhood, where Muhammad was chased out of Mecca. He says, I'm the victim, you were intolerant of me, therefore I'm justified in attacking the caravans headed back to you. And so Muslims will come into a very tolerant community and accuse their host of being intolerant, and they'll say, you were intolerant of us, therefore we're justified in whipping ourselves into a frenzy and attacking you. Now there's two sets of verses in the Quran, this is very important. The Meccan verses he gets in Mecca, and the Medinan verses he gets in Medina. In Mecca he was just a religious leader, so those verses are more peaceful. In Medina the verses are more political and military, and the later verses supersede the earlier verses. So by way of comparison, in the Bible, there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. Old Testament has some violence in it. Moses and Joshua wiping out tribes, right? And the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles never killed anybody. And so what do we say? The later example is the one we're going to strive to imitate. And it just happens to be peaceful, because Jesus and the apostles never killed anybody. It's the same way in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first. When Muhammad was a religious leader, in Mecca, they are called weak verses, and they are superseded by the later verses that come in Medina. They are called strong verses. So the last example Muhammad left was a political, military example. And so in 627 AD, the Meccans are really hurting because their caravans are being robbed, so they sent 10,000 soldiers to Medina. Turns out Muhammad is a brilliant military leader because he's creative, he's unpredictable, he's doesn't play by the rules of traditional Arab warfare. The Arabs had 1 month off a year where they agreed not to fight. It was their pilgrimage month. And they had all their different pagan gods and everything, and they would go to Mecca, they all worshiped their different religions, they got along. Well, this was a gentleman's agreement, a month off. They wouldn't fight. Muhammad gets verses from his Allah instructing him to fight during this month. And he catches them totally off guard, comes away with a lot of it. Anyway, so these Meccans are marching toward Medina. Muhammad's version of roadside bombs was he dug potholes all around the city, which rendered the cavalry useless. You can't charge your horse and camel across all these potholes and trenches. They'll break their legs. So it throws off the battle strategy. And so Muhammad goes to some of these Meccans at night, and he bribes them, and they slip away. He goes to some of the other Meccans at night, and he threatens them, and they slip away. So it's Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet, the silver or the lead, right? And so then it gets freezing cold for a week, and the rest of the Meccans lose heart and retreat. And when this happens, in Islam, there's the concept, when your enemy is strong, retreat. When your enemy is weak, attack. And so when all these Meccans retreat, Muhammad's like, they're showing weakness. He gets into the attack when he goes back into Medina. And remember those Jews that let him in 5 years earlier? There were 3 tribes of them. The first set of Jews, he gets offended at, he gets his followers whipped up in a frenzy. They attack that Jewish neighborhood, confiscate all their property, chase them out of town. The 2 other Jewish tribes sort of keep their head low, think, well, maybe you won't notice us. And then he picks on the second Jewish tribe. They do something that offends him. He gets his followers all whipped up in a frenzy. They attack that second Jewish neighborhood, confiscate all the property, chase them out of town. And the last Jewish tribe's keeping their head low, hope he doesn't notice me. Well, that set a precedent in Islam called Hudna, H-U-D-N-A, Hudna. It means when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So it's not a permanent thing, right? And so when Muhammad first comes to Medina, he's weak. He makes this treaty with them. Remember, he organized his followers and did the treaty. Now, Muhammad's in a position of strength. He just chased away the Meccans, and the Jews in this city are totally at his mercy, and he breaks the treaty that he had with the Jews. And that third Jewish tribe, he surrounds them in their neighborhood for 25 days. When they surrender, he brings them into the market and chops off their heads. 600 or 700 of them, he has their heads chopped off. And so within 5 years of Muhammad coming into the Jewish city of Medina, there's not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They're chased out, killed, or enslaved. And within 5 years of his death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia is wiped out. And so we see it's a 3-step process. Like Caesar's 3 steps, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Muhammad's 3 steps was immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate as a religious refugee into a host country. Increase the number of your followers and begin to get involved in politics and demand political accommodation. And then you whip your followers into random violence, lone wolf violence, and then people feel insecure and they move out of the neighborhoods and the Muslims take over. And so that's how you get 751 neighborhoods around Paris that have become totally Muslim, and these no-go zones in Holland. This is the controversial comments. It says, member of first U.S. majority Muslim city council warns, today we show the Polish. And so this is where they took over Hamtramck, Michigan, and set up their minarets and calls for prayer. So there's a 1,400-year track record of Muslim expansion, these 3 springs, Arab, Turkish, and then the current one. They do something called psychological projection. What's that? It's where the attacker blames the victim, called blame shifting. Karl Marx says, accuse others what you do. I don't know if you saw the tweet from David Nunes 2 days ago, and he says, whenever liberals accuse you of something, they're doing it themselves. Yeah. You saw that tweet? And so that's, Sigmund Freud coined the term. It's called psychological projection.
Oh, Russian collusion.
Yeah. And so it's a psychological projection where a rude person will project their rudeness onto others. Right? So there's this person that's rude, but they're calling everybody else is so rude. When they're actually the rude one. So hateful people will call everybody else hateful. They'll even put up a website where they list everybody that they hate. Yeah. And then intolerant people will call everybody else intolerant. Right? And so they'll actually take out money and buy news campaigns and ad campaigns in elections, and they'll accuse their opponent of being intolerant when they're the ones that want to set up a system that's intolerant. Yep. And so this psychological projection is where victimhood, you blame others. It's the victim's fault that attracts your hostility. So little kids on a playground do this. Right? A bully beats some kid up and says, well, it's your fault. You started it, even though he's pushing everybody else around. Wife beaters will beat the tar out of their wife and say, well, you offended me. It's you got me upset. It's your fault for getting me upset, so I beat the tar. Aggressor nations will use some little incident saying, you did this little incident, that's an excuse for us to come in and take over your country. Right? And so this blame is called provocation, but you provoked me, so it's your fault. And so this is the strategy. And anyway, So they'll come into a very tolerant host community and accuse their host of being intolerant of them, and then they use that as an excuse to attack them and drive them out. So this is what Muhammad did in the city of Medina. And by accusing their victims of offending them, they conquered, and they wanted their goals to set up a one world government. They wouldn't have been able to do it had not they gotten a hold of this technology. And so the Europeans were fighting with heavy metal swords. It takes two hands and they're on foot. Muslims are on Arabian horses with stirrups and scimitar swords. And the stirrup came from Mongolia, where they had little short horses, and they tie a rope around the horse, leave tubes hanging for your big toes, and they would ride barefoot to help keep balance. That made its way to China, and then across the Gobi Desert to Persia, and they make them out of metal with leather straps, and now you can stand in the saddle, put the full power of a galloping horse behind your sword, and they could literally slice someone in half while riding at a full gallop. So this is the U.S. Supreme Court chamber in Washington, D.C. It has lawgivers all around history. It has Muhammad with his Arabic crown and his scimitar sword. This is Muhammad's sword. It's in Istanbul, Turkey, in the top Kappa Palace, right? That's right next to the Hagia Sophia. And they got all the swords. They got Ali's sword, and Caliph Uthman's sword, and Caliph Omar. They got a whole room full of swords. And anyway, and so that they conquered. One of Muhammad's generals was Khalid ibn al-Walid. He was nicknamed the Drawn Sword of Allah. And so they conquered Syria, which used to be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria until Caliph Umar conquered. Then they conquered Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom. They conquered Jerusalem, which had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. His mother, St. Helena, built all these cathedrals there. And then the Muslims conquered Syria, and then they conquered Egypt. Egypt was completely Christian for 6 centuries. Evangelized by Mark, who wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, until Amir ibn al-As conquered Egypt. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. Right? St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage, today that's Tunisia. And then they invade Spain in the year 711. Spaniards are still on foot, heavy metal swords. Muslims are on Arabian horses with stirrups. And then in 10 years they conquer all of Spain. And then they come into Armenia and conquer, and then into Persia, and then into Afghanistan and Iraq. And this happened so fast, just within just a decade after Muhammad's death. And anyway, so then they hold back the ships of papyrus, right? They grew along the Nile Delta, these reeds, and when the Muslims cut off trade, there were no more paper shipped to Europe. So it was a paper shortage. And so it's called the Dark Ages. And then they destroyed the largest library in the world, in Alexandria, Egypt. And it took 6 months to burn all the books. The story is that they asked Caliph Umar what to do with the books. And he said, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy it. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant, because we have the Quran, so destroy them all. It took 6 months to burn them all. They're still doing it today. This was a news article. ISIS militants raided the Central Library in Mosul, Iraq, the old Nineveh, to destroy all non-Islamic books. These books promote infidelity, call for disobeying Allah, announced a militant to the residents, so they will be burned. So again, they look back to that Caliph Umar, that first generation, as their example. And anyway, then they invade Spain, conquered in 10 years, crossed the Pyrenees, conquered southern France, and they're finally stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, just 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They go from Arabia to Paris in a 100-year military campaign. And since this is the first century of Islam, there are some Muslims that look to this as their example, the same way Christians look to the first century of Christianity as our example. Just so happens that Jesus and the apostles never led armies, and Muhammad and all the caliphs led armies. Anyway. And then they try attacking Constantinople, but they're pushed back by the defenders having Greek fire. This is where they took oil and sawdust, mixed it in brass containers and sprayed it on these hot oil cannons. And so it's like napalm. And so the word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah. And Islam believes there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So it is a religion of peace. It's just their definition of the word peace is different than our definition. Our definition of peace is different groups getting along. Their definition of world peace is world Islam. When the whole world submits to the will of Allah, there's peace. There's no way left to fight. And so Lincoln said during the Civil War, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. Right? When the South says liberty, it means get the Union out. When the North says liberty, it's freeing the slaves. Right? So we say the same word, two different meanings. So the world's divided in two. The half that's submitted to Allah, the half that's in the process of submitting to Allah. The half that's submitted is the house of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, the house of submission. The other is the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. The non-Muslim world is supposed to be at war because it is in the process of submitting. Modern Muslims believe the world will submit to Allah later, maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world. Since it's so far off, they really don't think about it. They just want to live their lives, have their family, and they have no problem having you as a kafir infidel as a neighbor. And they can live their whole life like that, and they're happy like that. Fundamental Muslims think the world is supposed to submit to Allah now, and they're really excited. They want to help make it happen. But the dilemma we face is the nicer we show ourselves, the fundamental ones view that niceness as a weakness, and they take that as an indicator that they're supposed to get aggressive. And they will pressure the moderate ones, and then they will pressure the non-Muslim. So this is, excuse me, psychologist Nikolai Sennels says, Muslims instinctively see our lack of reaction as fear. It is an invitation to attack. So in nature, weakness invites aggression. You run from a dog, it'll chase you. You stop and turn and yell at it, it'll run away. Sharks can sense a distressed animal in the water, and they're drawn to want to go over and attack it. So there's something in nature that causes them to attack weakness. And now another word to define is the word innocent. When the killing takes place, politicians tell us, well, those killers do not represent true Islam, because Islam says it's wrong to kill the innocent. Let's define the word innocent. Innocent is a faithful follower of the way of Allah. And so if you are not a faithful follower of the way of Allah, you're not innocent. And so it says, Allah loveth not those who reject the faith. Be ruthless to the infidel, make war on the infidel, fight those who believe not in Allah, kill the disbeliever, wherever we find them. So when they say it's wrong to kill the innocent, it's code for it's wrong to kill a faithful Muslim. Now, in all due respect, the ones that are doing the killing, they view the non-violent Muslim as having left the way of Allah, and they're just as happy to kill a non-violent Muslim as they are to kill an infidel. So the non-violent ones are sort of in the middle, and they're happy to be under the shadow of the non-Muslim government if it shows itself strong, but if they're showing themselves weak, and they're coming in and saying, we'll threaten you, they're being pressured to move in the fundamentalist direction. Do you see it? And anyway, I'm just going to skip past some stuff for the sake of time. And how am I doing time-wise, Bill? I know I've been... it's time to quit?
Getting really close, yeah.
All right, let me... let's see here. The Sharia law controls every aspect of your life. And so they enslaved over 1.5 million Europeans. Whole Catholic orders in the Middle Ages called Trinitarians. Head of the order was called the ransomer, and they ransomed back their Christian friends who was captured. But then they didn't just do it in the Mediterranean, they went out in the Atlantic and they attacked England. In 1625, they carried away 1,000 from England. And then they attacked Ireland, and they carry away an entire village, the stolen village of Baltimore, Ireland. They take them off to Morocco, sell them into slavery. And then they enslave an estimated 180 million Africans. And castrate the men, make them eunuchs. Continues all the way up to, then they would take the boys from the Christian families and force them to become Muslim soldiers called Janissaries, or they'd put them in the Muslim pederasty, their homosexual culture, the sodomy of the Turks. So it was women for children, boys for pleasure, right? And but even David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary to the Congo, 1800s, writes about going through the jungle, coming across 1,000 Africans shackled together, being marched 500 miles to the coast to be sold into Muslim slavery. And he said, you know, more important than discovering the source of the Nile is if I could be a part of ending this monster that hangs over Africa, Muslim slave trade. And it still goes on today. Mauritania, Niger, Sudan, they still enslave people. Now, after the after the first spring, the Arab-Persian spring conquers, it sort of reaches an equilibrium. The Christians learn how to live as second-class citizens, and they started to moderate. And there was a guy named Al-Farabi, and he tries to incorporate Greek science and philosophy. It's called Islam's Golden Age. And there's another Muslim leader named Avicenna, and he writes 450 books on philosophy, medicine, and math. And he's saying things that maybe paradise is not this sensual place filled full of virgins. Maybe it's more spiritual. And they're beginning to moderate Islam and get into science and so forth, and math and astronomy and so forth. Averroes is another Muslim philosopher in Andalusia, Spain. He's writing music and geography, math and science. And if you were to take a snapshot of the world, you would have thought the Muslim world was about to experience the Renaissance. But there was a Muslim leader named Ghazali, and he slaps it all down really hard. And he said, he's a mujahideen, a renewer of the faith, and he criticizes those guys I just mentioned. And he said this: one should restrain anyone who would immerse himself in these mathematical sciences. For even though they do not pertain to the domain of religion, yet since they are among the foundations of the philosophers' sciences, the student will be infected with the evil and corruption of the philosophers. So he says, don't study geometry, because you'll get into Greeks and Greek philosophy, and you'll be pulled away from Allah. And so he slaps down the open-mindedness, and there's this closing of the Muslim mind. Meanwhile, in the West, you get Thomas Aquinas. He comes up with his philosophy that truth is truth, even if a pagan stumbles across it. So it's okay to read this Greek stuff, and whatever's true you keep, whatever's not you spit out. You know, like eat the hay, spit out the sticks. And so this is just in time for the Catholics to begin universities in Paris and Bologna and all these different places in Europe. And so the West experiences the Renaissance, where the Muslim world's mind is closed off because of Al-Ghazali. Does that make sense? And now, as the Muslims are invading into the Byzantine Empire, destroying all these Greek churches, well, there's so much I want to get into, but I don't have time. This is in my book. It's a really great comparison. I compare Jesus and Muhammad. If they say, well, Christians kill people, Muslims kill people, every religion has crazies that kill people. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that let's not compare followers, let's compare founders. Right? So let's talk about Jesus and talk about Muhammad. Let's talk about the Old Testament. No, we're not going to talk about the Old Testament. We're going to talk about Jesus, and we're going to talk about Muhammad. Well, David killed people, yeah, but we're going to talk about Jesus, and then we're going to talk about Muhammad. Jesus never killed anybody. Muhammad killed 3,000 people. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad owned slaves. Jesus never married. Muhammad had 11 to 22 wives. Jesus never tortured anyone. Muhammad stretched the sheath of Khaybar out on the ground and they kindled a fire on his chest because he wouldn't tell where the treasure was hidden. Jesus never lied. Muhammad permitted lying. It's called taqiyya, sacred lying. Jesus never forced anyone to follow him. One time he even said something difficult on purpose, and many disciples walked with him no more. And he turns to his apostles and says, you guys want to go too? There's the door. Peter said, where else can we go? You're the only one with the words of eternal life. He was willing to let them go. Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islam really kill him. Jesus forgave insults. They're mocking him on the cross. He says, Father, forgive him. Muhammad avenged insults. Jesus did not permit his disciples to rape anyone. Muhammad did. Jesus and the apostles were never governors or generals. Every caliph was a Muslim and a general. Jesus taught God was our Father. It is not much blasphemy to call Allah your Father. Jesus taught we're children of God. It is not blasphemy to call yourself a child of Allah. Because Allah took no wife and has no son. Jesus taught we're made in the image of God. In Islam, Allah has no image. Jesus taught to have a personal relationship with God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah. He's unknowable. Even in the next life, you'll never know him. And so, first 3 centuries of Christianity, there's 10 major persecutions, and Christians are thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. They never led an armed resistance against the Roman Emperor. First 3 centuries of Islam, it's a military campaign from Arabia to Paris. Anyway, there's a whole lot more, but you've been so kind to listen. And I want to end with this one thought. In times of crisis, people turn to Christ. How many of you, came to the Lord when everything was perfect? How many of you have a crisis, right? How many of you tend to pray more when things are not going good? So it's in times of crisis that we turn to the Lord, but it's also in times of crisis that leaders are raised up. So we never would. What are the stories we like in the Bible? When there's a crisis, God raises up a 17-year-old David or an 80-year-old, Moses, and so God loves to wait until things look hopeless when He raises up those nobodies. And so the thought is that someday you're going to be dead, and you're going to be in heaven because you believe that the Lord paid for your sins on the cross, right? And the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. And so when you've been, like the song, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining is the sun, with no less days to sing his praise, though we just begun. Imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years, and you get a chance to meet Moses. That'd be pretty neat. He's certainly up there. And, you know, walking the streets of gold. Jesus said, in my Father's house are many mansions. I don't really quite understand it, but I bet Moses would have a pretty nice place. He'd probably have one of those big fireplaces with the logs don't burn out. You don't get it, but burning bush in the wilderness that Moses saw, it didn't burn up, and the log in the fireplace. Anyway, I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll be able to travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. And my wife will say, where were you? I said, I was thinking about something else. But imagine being there. We all gather together. We're in Moses' living room up there, this man, and after the small talk's over, you can't help yourself. Moses is sitting right in front of you. Say, Moses, tell us the story again. I read the story, and I saw the movie, but here you are in person. And so he'll stand up, and so I was 80 years old, and Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in us. We were totally unarmed. And I said, God, just use me to make a difference. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. I said, wow. Then we're going to see David. Say, David, tell us your story. The room will get quiet, we'll stand up. Because I was a teenager, this Goliath monster was mocking our faith, and these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything. And I said, well, enough of them. I took my little sling and hit him in the head and so forth. And then we're going to have, you know, Gideon tell his story. Everybody's going to tell their story. It's going to be great. And then everybody in the room is going to look at you. Say, you, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell us your story. What did you do when it was your turn to be on earth? What were they saying about God in your country? Or the baby in the Lord knew in the mother's womb, like, you know, Jeremiah or John the Baptist? Or what did you do when marriage was attacked, right? Jesus himself said, right? It says in the beginning, man shall leave the father, mother, cleave his wife, two shall become one. So he believed it's a man and woman. And what did you do when the whole world was against you? And it looked so totally hopeless, and they're sitting on the edge of their seat looking at you. What are you going to say? I hate for any of us to be up there saying, well, you know, I turned the channel when the girls came on, and I threw a couple bucks in the offering plate, you know. No, so my country was going down the drain, and they were doing this and all this terrible stuff, and I said, I'm going to stand up and make a difference, right?